audience. He's got the voice that will win over the millions.
Thanks, Joe. That was the introduction to the stream.
Oh, cool.
Welcome to Clean Room, a controlled environment for uncontrolled conversation. And this is a book club for, I was corrected. I have to say Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. Helen Pluckrose's name is first on the book. Their book, Cynical Theories. And with me is Sam Hoadley-Brill. Is that how you say it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Who hates James Lindsay with a passion and has gotten into a Twitter flame war with him until he got blocked. This is sort of from the Discord server on IDW's Discord server, and so we're probably more going to lean towards the authors of this book and being in favor of this book. So Sam is hosting because he takes the other side of this. It will make for a better conversation, I think, especially if he's leading. So for today, the first session, let me do some rules first. So rules, if you want to participate, there's a link to the Discord. You can come into the voice chat and talk. I will mute you if you're a problem or if your mic sucks. It's nothing personal. We're trying to keep the conversation as focused as possible. I don't think we're going to have any problem with it. I just felt the need to say that. If you want to participate in text, use the YouTube channel, the YouTube chat, and I can display on screen anything that you say to facilitate the conversation. Anyway, so today we are going to go over the introduction, which I have no notes for. I don't know if you do, Sam. It was pretty basic to me.
Yeah, a few things that I thought were a little questionable.
Wow, you hate this guy that much.
I also want to say that this book is co-authored, right? We don't want to leave Helen Pluckrose out of my trashing, right? I mean, she has to get some too. And I believe that she actually is behind the book more than Lindsay, at least in terms of the substance of the text. She wrote the first draft. And she said a couple times that there was a lot. It was a lot longer, and so a lot of stuff has been left out because of the edits. But so I think it's actually more Pluckrose than Lindsay in the book.
Are we all on the Discord going to be on the stream as well, or is it just you two who are audible on the stream?
Your voice is coming through fine. I'm not gonna put. I'm not able to easily put the Discord image on screen, so I won't be doing that. It's just the screen's basically just going to be this the whole time. But yeah, your voice is, if you're in the channel, you're on. I can't see your face though. Oh, Eric, hey.
No worries. Yeah, hey, my name's Eric. I'm the moderator of the Los Angeles Intellectual Dark Web Meetup Discord. I'm here to talk shit about Sam because I think Sam has the wrong take on it. Sam knows that though. We've had our own disagreements, and I think Sam's arguing in good faith, but we happen to disagree on the interpretation of Lindsay and Pluckrose.
Gee, I've never had a disagreement with Sam ever publicly in front of everybody.
Honestly, nobody in this stream has ever disagreed with me. Like, I'm really shocked to hear this. So
just so agreeable.
Do we want to do? Do we want to do?
Ask Jordan Peterson. We all score really high on agreeableness.
Do we want to do introductions for people who want to participate, and if anybody comes in, they can introduce themselves as well, or do we want to just go right into it? So Eric's here.
I think they already know who I am from episode 3.
Joe is here. Sam is here. I'm gonna call out Choopy. Choopy's here.
Hi.
Jenks is here, and Skep, who I think his name is Joe. But
hey, what's up?
Oh.
Did you just dox Skep?
I did, but that was his original names on the server, so not really. He kind of doxed him, his first name. My girlfriend doxed me.
Your girlfriend doxed you?
Joe's on the Discord store.
Yeah, my girlfriend.
I'm the one Joe.
She's gotten kind of popular on TikTok. She jumped from like 400 followers to 4,000 in like a day.
Yeah, that'll happen.
Because of some stuff, and she doxed me. She told people where we live.
What?
Not not specifically, but
okay.
Anyway, let's get back on track. So introduction in chapter 1 is on the schedule for today. The introduction is really simple, but Sam, of course, already has issues with it. This is a preview for what's to come.
So, I mean, there's just some sweeping statements in there. So basically what we have in the intro, we start by the authors telling us that there has developed a consensus in favor of liberalism as a political philosophy in most Western countries over the past 200 years. And this is now being threatened from both sides of the political spectrum. We have on the far right, there are populist movements behind throwing their support behind dictators. And on the far left, we have social justice warriors who are armed with diversity and inclusion seminars. And
they did recently have CHOP too. We got to see what they really want to happen. This is what liberals actually want. They want Chaz, segregated gardens, based on social justice.
Yeah, you can argue that. I'm just gonna focus on what the book says, though. The book.
By the way, I thought it was helpful. Some of your early feedback on the book, Sam, was really helpful. That in general, I approached the introduction and chapter 1, and I'm going to approach the rest of the book where I have a specific mark where there's a claim that they make where I feel a citation is needed, and it goes without a citation. I think it's useful to have. I was a bit surprised because some of your claims, even about the introduction being unsubstantiated, I made marks in the introduction and then found that they substantiated some of those claims in chapter 1. So I'll be interested to see whether or not they produce a cogent defense of their claims, because I was looking for it. I'm really open to the idea that they don't substantiate their claims.
Eric's doing my job for me. I don't have to do anything.
So, cool. Let's get there. So then they tell us that this the fight between the social justice warriors and the right wingers, who are the far right populist people, they say this culture war is sufficiently intense that it has come to define political and increasingly social life through the beginning of the 21st century. Now, if they claimed over the last 5 years or something, I'd be fine with that. But I just think that that's a bit of a lofty claim that, in 2008, we were fighting the same culture war that we're fighting now, or in 2001.
Come on, the culture war speech is from the 90s. We knew that the culture war was going on before the 2000s. So I don't know how you can claim that our social life is not also being dominated by political identities when political tribalism was already being able to define cultural life in the 90s, so that there was a speech about it called the culture war speech.
I think
so. How can you deny that how can you say that they're wrong?
Did it define our lives? Did it define our political life?
I think there's some truth on both sides of this. So I think
I'm confused.
So
I mean,
here, let me lay this out. Let me lay this
goes
out.
on where it's they make a general historical and social claim, and it's oh, how can they substantiate that? Sure, it's a broad claim, but other people do make the claim, but I feel like they could cite it as well. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
You are fine. I want to lay out what I think this is. I'm going to try to be a moderator here. I cannot believe that I'm going to be the one doing this. I think that you're both are talking about the same thing and drawing different conclusions. So, Eric, I think you're connecting the fact that what we're experiencing today is part of what was happening in the 80s and 90s. What you're describing. This is connected to that. It's not separate from it. But I don't think necessarily that it was dominating our lives I think it was dominating our lives in the 2000s. Personally, I think it was not as overt, but I think it was secretly dominating our lives. But I can't say in the 90s that I think that was true. But I do agree that it's sort of connected to for me, post World War II, people losing their mind after World War II.
Yeah, I think it's a thesis whose realization we've seen over time, but then a number of authors commented on in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but it's come to a point where it's increasingly separating our cultural and social lives, such that I think in the present day, parents are more likely to say that they would be upset that their children marry someone of a different political orientation than almost any other identity factor. So, I mean, that doesn't happen overnight, obviously. It happens over the period of many years, but that was something that was basically non-existent when there was so much overlap between Democrats and Republicans as recently as the 60s, including in voting habits, but also cultural, political behavior.
The way I see it is to the victor go the spoils, and the people who were not these like more radical people didn't realize we were at war in the 2000s and the early 2010s. I mean, I think that they didn't really realize that there was a war, and then that they lost it, the culture war.
Yeah. I hate for us to get hung up on the culture war as far as like what is the particular claim about it and what is true, but
how
this
about
is one
this?
of those nitpicks where I'm like, I'm going to go insane if I don't point out that I think that nitpick's unfair.
Sure.
But I think with many of the places where I felt citation was needed, especially with things like interpretations of Foucault and interpretations of other authors that we'll get into chapter 1, there are two types of citations needed. One is a historical claim that they need to substantiate. I'm going to make it three types now, actually. A historical claim that they could substantiate. One is like an author actually says this, and they usually substantiate that to an extent. And then there's three, which is that this is a valid interpretation of the author. And I think those are like three different ways in which like you can draw different citation needed marks for each of those things. But I thought there were actually many more places where they made an interpretation of postmodernism in general or Foucault in general, where it's like you could at least show that other people interpreting postmodern think about it this way. Would you say did you have other ways that you were thinking about like where they needed citations, Sam, or were you just feeling like so many of their claims are unsubstantiated that there's just like in general they leave total unsubstantiated claims and it's a broader problem than we ought to even categorize?
No, I think that's totally a fine way to categorize the kinds of citations needed.
Okay,
maybe there's even more than just a historical claim, because you also brought up that they have a defense of liberalism and capitalism that you feel that they don't substantiate.
That it wouldn't be necessarily in terms of citations. It's just that they don't really give us an argument or anything like it.
I'm gonna
instead they could cite someone who does give an argument.
I'm gonna pause this. Yeah. I'm gonna pause this for now because a lot of what you guys are talking about is contextual to things outside of where we've gotten in the book.
Yeah.
We've literally not gotten into the book yet. So
we're doing first grade summarization first. Summarize the book.
I think first. I think that we should continue forward. And I've personally decided not to even read Sam's critique until chapter 8 because I didn't want it to influence the way that I read the book. And then I'm not going to, because it's mostly centered around chapter 8, and I'm not going to read it until after I've gotten to that point in the book. And then we can really go into it in that session. And that's why in that session, we've left just chapter 8 and Sam's work and some supplemental stuff that he thinks would be relevant to that conversation. So I think generally we can I think you'll probably get a lot of agreement among people that the citation in this book is not academic. I mean, this would never be publishable in any academic sense. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that that's the audience that this book is attempting to reach. I think that this
popular book, but you'd be surprised even if you read a book like Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate or Enlightenment now, there'll be some pretty major claims in there, and then you look how he substantiates them. And Pinker's like a thorough thinker, provides a lot of citations, but he also makes a ton of claims. And some of those citations you go, oh, well, it says kind of substantiates it in there, kind of doesn't. Like, I don't know. I wonder. I think if you are gonna have these kind of critiques
with that kind of book
them,
too.
I guess so. Developing a political philosophy based off of empirical knowledge is just garbage, right? You got to start from general armchair theory. This is the world fit around it.
This is always a problem in philosophy because philosophy is tracking thought back to the beginning. I mean, it's just a stream supposedly. I don't like that view on it, but I mean, in order to understand postmodernism, you need to understand modernism, and in order to understand modernism, you're going to have to understand. So I think there's some value in some people writing a book trying to describe it to people who are never going to read all that stuff and describe it in terms that are relevant to their daily lives or to decisions maybe that I'm assuming this is going to go into academia, but at some point, but maybe things that people would want to think about if they're sending their children to school or if they themselves want to go to school. So I think there's value on both sides of that. I forget who it was who brought up a review where somebody said that the detractors will take it too seriously and the critics won't take it seriously enough. And I think that is really apt. I think that's really apt and correct, I think. Because in the same way, well, I'm not gonna go out there. I've already gone on too long a tangent. Let's try to go back to the book because I got like a ton of notes here that I want my questions answered.
So just in terms of the other things I found in the intro, so we get so they tell us that there's a culture war between the left and the right, and then they tell us that the problem on the right, it's a serious problem, but they're not going to talk about it in this book because they know the left better and they think that they can explain the problem on the left, right? And they make it clear, like we're not saying the right's not a problem. We just want to focus. They said we have become experts in the nature of the problem on the left, and they say that. So they say, as we have written previously, the problem arises from the fact that, quote, the progressive left has aligned itself not with modernity with a capital M, but with postmodernism, which rejects objective truth as a fantasy dreamed up by the naive and or arrogantly bigoted enlightenment, capital E, thinkers who underestimated the collateral consequences of modernity, capital M's progress. Okay. So already we have postmodernism as a rejection of objective truth, which you'll see, I think, none of the postmodernist thinkers have claimed that there's no such thing as objective truth, because as everybody knows, that statement itself is a statement that purports to describe an objective truth, and this is like a sophomoric freshman philosophy class version.
Sure, but that's what they get into that definition in chapter 1, right? And they talk about they're really, I mean, perhaps it's they're misspeaking to call it like postmodernism rejects objective truth. It's that they reject the knowability of truths about the world,
which is a crucial distinction,
which they make in chapter 1.
And but continue to, I'll point to more parts of the text where they contradict themselves.
Okay.
So you feel like they blur the line between sort of the knowing and the truth.
You're trying to get me on screen now so you can see my goofy faces.
I'm gonna actually just.
No.
God damn it,
Sam, you're trying to get it ahead of yourself. I mean, that's their thesis, that these critical theorists, are doing this stuff. That's what. So like, by you just saying, oh, they don't prove that. I mean, we're on chapter 1. Like we got the whole book to go.
Oh, so, God, that's terrible.
I mean, right, and I just tried to say that I will come back to that.
Hey, Sam, do you want to turn your camera on in Discord instead, since there's so many people here that it might be worth it just to show the screen?
Yeah, sure.
You can end the meet if that's easier.
Yeah, so is it going to be a problem if I'm on in here too, or no?
No, as long as you keep it muted the way you are. You know what? Leave meets open.
Leave meets open.
Yeah, so that you can get the audio from everybody else without causing an echo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah. So wow, Eric, that's a lot of.
So Sam, can I ask? Essentially, what you're saying is that they're stating that postmodernism is strictly subjective, yet they're making objective claims. Is that what you're trying to communicate?
Well, what I was trying to say here is just to point out that they're portraying postmodernism as a rejection of the notion of objective truth, and that.
But they're making objective claims.
As we'll talk about later, is no. When I said that, I was pointing out how nobody believes in that. It's a straw man because it's the most obviously self-defeating position ever.
Okay.
Yeah, most postmodernists, because I end up talking to a lot of postmodernists who identify with postmodern schools of psychotherapy, and they'll be, it's interesting to see these ideas in action in something like clinical practice. And yeah, I'll have therapists say like, oh, well, obviously, like our language is not constructing whether or not this wall is here, but those distinctions of what is and what isn't, the sort of ontological claims of like, can we know what can we really know what is out there? The epistemological and ontological claims of what's out there. Can we know what's out there? Can we modify what's out there with our language? They obviously don't think we can modify what's out there with our language when it comes to something like the wall. But those distinctions become a lot fuzzier when it comes to the lived experience, like whether someone was actually oppressing you, like, or whether you are actually like a survivor, or like how you're transforming your own like subjective experience. So like the truth that you can transform your subjective experience, there's not quite this objective reality of how you ought to experience your internal lived experience. That's where the distinctions of postmodernism I see come into play in something like clinical practice, where it's like, yeah, I think to someone who's not familiar with those like hard line definitions of like what exactly is meant by objective and subjective, they would read this statement, and even after trying to read postmodernism and kind of find it unobjectionable. But to someone like you or me, Sam, who's like, well, we have these very clear definitions of what's meant by objective truth, and obviously that's not necessarily something postmodernists fully reject, but they reject, the knowability of it, which is, I mean, I feel like you're just not being charitable to like Lindsay at that point.
I'm gonna push back with some stuff in the chat because there's a lot of people in chat who are on Sam's side here. And I'm gonna put it up actually.
That's not allowed.
So no, I mean,
Well,
like
all I was
Eric's
gonna
pushing.
say in response was, Eric, like I wish that they had written in the book what you just said, but they really don't.
Yeah, I point out that they make the actual distinction in chapter 1. So I mean,
Well,
they literally
They
say
make the distinction and then
postmodernism
they go
rejects
back on the
objective
distinction
truth.
several times.
Okay,
They go back on
Also,
it.
Sam,
We'll
like,
get there.
if
Okay,
you
that's
look at videos
interesting. We'll
on
look at that.
YouTube, and you can hear Michel Foucault talking, and he pretty much says like he's pretty much a cultural relativist, like purist. Like he says, how could you tell, America is better than, some tribe in Africa? You just can't know that. So like
Where does he say that?
You know what's funny here?
I don't have the YouTube thing. He says it pretty clearly. Like I don't have the YouTube, link up, but he's like a
Let's get to Foucault when we get to Foucault.
So
cultural relative.
I want to bring up some stuff in the chat, just to push back on Eric a little bit, and actually, you know what? I feel like the resistance to postmodernism is actually too far a little bit within the IDW, and I push back on postmodernism quite a bit. So Logos Sarsgaard said, first they said, brave to base your entire view of history of philosophy on Stephen Hicks, which made me chuckle. And then skepticism is postmodern, ? And that's true. Skepticism is not postmodern. I mean, modernism was very skeptic. So being skeptical by itself is not really a problem. And it's, here's my personal take here. And me and Sam have gone over and over this, is the problem with postmodernism is it seems to say it's okay to be skeptical of everything except postmodernism, and that to me is a grand meta narrative, and it kind of eats itself. That's how I see it. Like, if is there anything within postmodern that any of these postmodernist philosophers have said that they would say is worthy of skepticism? Because if not, how is that?
I mean, I think they would be totally open to having skepticism toward anything that they say, but skepticism towards something doesn't lead necessarily to disagreement with it. Like, you might be skeptical about the claim, we shouldn't burn babies alive, right? You could have a skeptical, you'd be like, I don't know, maybe we should. And then when you think about it, you're like, nah, we probably shouldn't burn babies.
No, my point is, can you be skeptical of being skeptical? Can you be skeptical of the fact that being skeptical actually can be a problem?
Sure, yeah, of course.
You can.
Why not?
Yeah, we're getting so meta.
I don't see why not.
Yeah, I don't understand.
And, I mean,
like,
so many of these postmodernists disagreed with each other, so obviously, there was some skepticism going on.
I'm apparently not communicating my point very well.
Well, like
So,
they make
okay.
a specific claim on page 22 that's sort of in this line.
Wait,
It
we're
says
not
postmodernism.
past the intro yet.
This is in the intro.
What is it? Yeah. Is it in the intro?
Jumping around.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
page 22 is chapter 1.
Oh, is it? I'm
Yep.
sorry. Yeah, it's right at the start of chapter. Oh, we're still all right. Yeah, we're kind of jumping around, but
no, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go ahead. Yeah. But yeah, right at the start of chapter 1, they're talking about sort of skepticism, and they say postmodernism raised such radical doubts about the structure of thought in society that it is ultimately a form of cynicism. So, would you agree with that sort of characterization, postmodernism?
So I'm of the belief that they haven't even given us a really good definition of postmodernism. I'm not sure whether a definition of postmodernism is possible or would be useful if possible.
I agree with that.
That's a caveat they make within I'm with you here.
But then they go on to just use the
Postmodernism
term without really.
Okay, so they're naming a group of thinkers. A group of thinkers we refer to as postmodernists. Their ideas, it's not easy to nail down exactly what their ideas are. They try and nail down some of the themes of them, but we also know that there are a number of fields that have built upon some of these ideas. Some of the social critiques of Foucault and something like Madness and Civilization have been built upon in many other places. Like, should we trace the loss of mental health institutions, public state mental health institutions in California to something like Foucault's Madness and Civilization? Like, I have no idea because I haven't spent the time doing the historical work on that, but I don't doubt that it has some influence within academia to influence critical theories. One, because I went and I got a lit degree where I learned feminist critical theory to interpret literary texts, and we were reading Michel Foucault, and we were reading Derrida, and we were, we also read some people from the Frankfurt School, like Adorno, but primarily for like some of the feminist critiques, it was largely influenced by people like Foucault.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's value in studying these thinkers, and that a lot of these thinkers have been.
My claim isn't about the value. My claim is about the genealogy of these ideas, which is what Lindsay is trying to outline. Lindsay and Pluckrose are trying to outline in this book. So to say like, oh, we can't even really know what postmodernism is. Well, that's fucking postmodern. Like,
no, that my final note that I made at the end of the chapter was postmodernism is inherently and intentionally indefinable. Any definition or categorization gives it structure, which it expertly deconstructs. So it's
very broad, and a lot of it is a flavor of like a way of approaching subjects. I mean, you read like Roland Barthes' essays in mythologies, and you go like, is this really social critique? Like waxing poetic on soap detergent? Like, I don't know, what am I supposed to get from this? But like, there is some sort of coherence there that it's cohering with some of the ideas of the other French philosophers of the time that they're referring to as postmodernists.
So just to answer the Jenks, right? Good question. Is it? Do I think it's right to say that postmodernism is ultimately, just like if I'm just referring to the four thinkers that they focus on in chapter 1, is it right to say that these thinkers ultimately are just cynics, right? That's all they're doing is being cynical? No, but I haven't read enough of their works to so I haven't seen anything to make me think that ultimately all these thinkers are doing is just being cynical. It's possible that that's right, but I haven't seen enough evidence to think so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in that passage, they sort of structure what they mean by that, right? Is it so doubtful about how we think and about how society functions that it's just cynicism? Like, I think that's a specific claim.
Yeah, and
I don't know that is a very specific claim, because cynicism is something so general. It's sort of just saying like postmodernism bad, like postmodernism reject good. Postmodernism by being not good is bad. Like, that's sort of what's being communicated by the cynicism. I don't think that's a very deep claim. That's a value judgment.
I could see it being a little more than a value judgment, being like, cynicism to me means something like it's so focused on what's wrong that it loses sight of the value of trying to build a constructive path forward or something like that.
Yep, I would agree with
And
that.
if that's the interpretation, then I think I haven't seen reason necessarily. I think that a lot of postmodernists are pretty pessimistic. At least Lyotard seems, Lyotard seems to be pretty pessimistic, and Baudrillard as well. I don't think Foucault has to be interpreted very pessimistically. I think a lot of people seem to interpret him and what his claims are making as pessimistic, because he's just sort of, he's giving a lot of reasons to that would undermine certain certain beliefs that are very popular, like that you live in like the best country in the world or something like that, like that, you know, that humanity has made immense progress, and he's not saying that we haven't made progress. He's just raising some reasons that might speak against or count against that.
He's definitely, I feel like Foucault, you can read him charitably like that, or you can read him uncharitably, where I see Foucault as picking out, you know, in the 60s when he was writing, like, if you take something like Madness and Civilization, he's picking out like a particularly weak area of medical science towards the treatment of mental health disorders, and then using it to say, like, this is why the sort of value judgments that we hear made about mental health and madness are things that we accept on their face value, and we ought to reject them for good reasons. And to some extent, he's right, and to some extent, he's wrong. Fortunately, we didn't completely reject that in our society, but Foucault, in many ways, is suggesting that if they're wrong about this, don't you think they're wrong about many other things that they claim are extremely well-established knowledge? He's certainly encouraging skepticism about what you consider to be the most well-established knowledge, which is, I mean, if it's not cynicism, it's at least sort of like mildly conspiratorial, like believing that there's a conspiracy of like controlling what others can think and know. Like that seems to be what he's talking about with his knowledge power discussions, is that like the power, the things you think are most true are the things that are most likely to be infected with power, and you ought to be skeptical of them.
Well, I mean, so there, of the few things I did read of Foucault in sort of to assess the claims made in the book, many come from some interviews he gave at the end of his life, closer to the end of his life, where he was asked some questions about common misinterpretations of his work, and among those was the idea that power is a problem, right? That like power should be viewed skeptically, any more than anything else should be viewed skeptically. So for instance, I mean, he clarifies it like, there's a good quote where he says something like, you tell them that knowledge is power, and they say, it was never knowledge after all. And he's like, no, this is not the right interpretation. Like saying that something is based in power or is crucially intertwined with power is not saying that it's not valuable. He talks about like sexual relationships. There's a lot of power dynamics going on in intimate sexual relationships, right? And that's a beautiful thing.
Everything is about sex, except sex, which is about power.
Well, I don't think he says that.
No, I think that's a quote from someone else. That I can't remember who that is, but it's a good one.
But Foucault was another thing that we'll get to, but I just want to bring up is pretty much all of Foucault, when all of their discussion where they talk about like Foucault like thinks that like Foucault like deconstructing the sciences, it's particularly he calls it human sciences, right? So things like anthropology and psychology and sociology and things like that were very popular at the day. He like made it explicitly clear that when he like the things that people interpret as really radical that he says about the sciences are not meant at all to apply to something like chemistry or theoretical physics or anything like that.
This is becoming a discussion about postmodernist philosophers and not the book. So I'm like this.
Book is about
Okay,
postmodernist
yeah.
philosophers.
I know, but
first
this would be
chapter.
great as like a discussion after we go
Once
through
we
the
get there.
chapters we're trying to go through.
Yeah.
But if we don't go
Yeah.
through the chapters, this is not a book club.
Okay, so okay.
That's see,
then
I'm not a postmodernist because I've categorized this. It's a book club.
Yeah.
Tell Sam
Okay.
to keep summarizing. Stop critiquing them.
Yes. Right.
No,
I'm just
no,
responding to points that were raised. I'm just responding to points that were
No,
raised. Okay.
you're not. You make them. You raise the point. I respond to them, and then you respond to that response, and we get off track.
Okay. Fair. So then, yeah. Okay. Real thing I have to bring up. They say when they talk about social justice, they start to say that like this movement calls itself social justice, but it's not social justice in the harmless sounding sense and the like very good sounding sense. It's not liberal social justice. They say they talk about John Rawls as like an example of someone who pursues liberal social justice, and they say John Rawls laid out much philosophical theory dedicated to the conditions under which a socially just society might be organized. In this, he set out a universalist thought experiment in which a socially just society would be one in which an individual given a choice would be equally happy to be born into any social justice or any social milieu or identity group. Equally happy to be born into any social milieu or identity group. This is not what Rawls says. This is just a false interpretation of Rawls.
Wait,
what Rawls says.
What was wrong with that? That sounds like a paraphrase of Rawls.
It's absolutely false. So they said Rawls says a just society is one in which anyone would be equally happy born into any group, any social group. Not at all.
No, he says any position, as any person. Any position, right?
No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say it's not about how equally happy someone would be born into any group. It's about constructing a society where the basic principles governing the society, economically and politically, are chosen from behind a veil of ignorance where one does not know one's own identity. So it's about the part about like any social group. What that is behind the veil of ignorance, where the choices
what page is there
where the choices are made about what basic principles govern the basic structure of society. The principle that there will be inviolable civil liberties for every person, and the principle that any inequality that exists will only be allowed to exist insofar as it contributes to the well-being of those who are worse off. Those are the two principles, and those are chosen from behind a veil of ignorance where you don't know your identity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just wrong. And of course, they give the citation to Rawls. They don't cite a page number. They just say Rawls' theory of justice.
I'm reading the quote. It's on page 13.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you disagree that it's an honest interpretation of Rawls that he would say a socially just society would be one in which an individual given a choice would be equally happy to born into any social milieu or identity group. I mean, I understand there are distinctions where Rawls has things like the minimax, like things we're supposed to draw out of Rawls, and that Rawls is really about the formation of rules in a just society, but that's just an uncharitable interpretation of like, oh, not interpreting Rawls in the way that we ought to summarize Rawls. It's not what
he's talking about.
This is you're making a normative claim of this is not how someone ought to summarize Rawls. Where I'm just not interested.
It's a false summary. Not what the thought experiment says.
That's just straight up uncharitable. That's a way that many people interpret and describe the thought experiment. I understand there are different parts with the veil of ignorance in the original position. Like, but that is a valid way to describe the thought experiment. Like, it's a paraphrase. It's a fucking summary.
The proposition it expresses is false. I don't know what you mean.
Dude, like, I don't know how we can begin to have these discussions. Again, I didn't raise this one. You raised, this is an invalid way to summarize Rawls, when it very clearly isn't. That's just straight up uncharitable.
I actually...
Like, you're such a fucking nitpicker. You drive me nuts.
Can we get to the next point? No one knows
yeah, please. Stop shitting on it and summarize the damn thing.
I wanted
Cool.
to jump into
Okay.
something that is said later to see if you have a critique of this, but I forget where. I have it written down somewhere. In chapter 1, they talk about how interpretation is really based on how somebody reads it. So there's infinite interpretation. So how can you? I can't help but get meta because it's the way that I see it. It's like, how is postmodernism as defined defendable from what it does to everybody else? That's how come Eric can't interpret it that way based on the postmodern framework? If he interprets it that way, isn't that the interpretation in a postmodern lens?
I'm not a postmodernist.
No, I know. It's just for me that's the big poking hole in postmodernism for me, is like, if that's true, then I never have to believe anything you say because I don't want to.
If that's the right interpretation of postmodernism, is that these thinkers are saying any interpretation is valid, then yeah, that's clearly a problem for them. I haven't been given evidence to think that that's what they
that's what I figured.
saying.
I figured that you would disagree with that description. I forget where it is in chapter 1. I have a note. I was going to go through them as we got to them.
It's towards the end, I think, when we talk about Derrida, I think.
Yeah.
But okay, so let me try to just finish up the summary. They say they spend a few pages explaining the social justice ideology, capital S, capital J. They have their own language. They have their own culture. They're like aliens. But Pluckrose and Lindsay have spent a couple of years trying to learn this language and learn this culture. And they're fluent in it now, so they can explain it to us. And that's what they do in the rest of the book. It's okay, yeah. Then that brings us to chapter 1.
I did not take any notes on the introduction because I just thought this is just a mission statement. That's how I read it. This is what we hope.
The introduction was kind of general, and they only end up having three footnotes, or endnotes, actually. They only have 3 endnotes at all in the introduction, and the endnotes, I think they have 33 in chapter 1, so they start piling up.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Sam, can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
So I'm familiar with like the idea of veil of ignorance, and I sort of tend to agree with Eric's point that obviously this isn't like a verbatim, repeat of what Rawls says. But it does seem like this is how people interpret that. Do you feel like that's a bad interpretation? Like that's
I'll
not
try to
true?
give another answer briefly. So what they say is that Rawls for Rawls, in a just society, anyone would be equally happy born into any identity group, any race, any gender, any socioeconomic class, whatever it is, right? Now, so the point of not knowing your identity is about the individual, right? It's like any individual not knowing their identity would be equally happy in any of these groups. So it's about the individual, and it's about happiness level, right? For Rawls, the point of the veil of ignorance is about choosing the principles that are going to govern like a brand new society.
Yeah.
So it's not at all about happiness, and it's not at all about I think Rawls he sort of evolves over his career and has different things, but I think Rawls clearly doesn't think that it's true that everyone would be, if it's not the case that anyone would be happy to be born into any identity category, then that would be an unjust society. Because that's what follows from this, right? If you're in a society where it's not true that anyone would be equally happy born into any identity category, then it's a socially unjust society. But Rawls thinks, as far as I can tell, that it's okay for there to be disparities in happiness levels, as long as those disparities are working to benefit those who are least well off.
So you feel like maybe the claim in the book goes farther than the claim that Rawls makes?
it goes farther in some sense, but it's also just a little bit misguided. It doesn't understand what the veil of ignorance is trying to do for him.
Okay. Well, I mean, I understand that criticism. To me, it seems like it's in the spirit of what he said, though. Like that, I don't think it would be
Like
if you went up to him and you asked him, "Do you think this?" Like, I think he would be more than likely he would agree with that statement, based on. You don't think so?
You're talking about like an academic philosopher. Like he's gonna treat it like a serious claim. He's gonna interpret it as it's said. And you say, no, my view is this.
Okay.
Which is not what they said.
Okay. Well, I can understand. I can understand. That's sort of what I was trying to get at. I think as a philosopher, I think you could say you wouldn't agree with that statement. I think most people that just like sort of casually read about the veil of ignorance, like sort of the thought experiment, that would be something that they would agree with. They would say that this claim.
Well, I think we need the general principle, which is that philosophers never agree with summaries of their ideas.
Yeah,
like
that's probably
as a general principle, a philosopher will never agree with the summary of their ideas. However, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it says Rawls contends the most rational choice for the parties in the original position are two principles of justice. The first guarantees the equal basic rights and liberties needed to secure the fundamental interests of free and equal citizens and to pursue a wide range of conceptions of the good. The second principle provides fair equality of educational and employment opportunities, enabling all to fairly compete for powers and positions of office, and it secures for all a guaranteed minimum of the all-purpose means, including income and wealth, that individuals need to pursue their interests and to maintain their self-respect as free and equal persons. It seems like I could paraphrase that and say that an individual given a choice, so the individual is given the choice behind the veil of ignorance in the original position to be born into any socially milieu or identity group, meaning that they will accept that no matter what position they're born into in society, they've established the rules such that they're entering a just society where they're going to be equally happy to be starting from there. That seems kind of like a fair paraphrase. And but then again, we're running into the general rule of philosophy right there. The first one I established. No philosopher is gonna accept like a summary of their ideas.
Okay, but thanks for clarifying that. I just wanted to sort of understand, and I think I have a better idea of what you're saying.
All right, chapter 1. So they start by saying this big change started in the 1960s, and the changes associated with several French theorists. They give us Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and they later bring in Baudrillard and briefly Deleuze and Guattari as well. So they tell us, okay, what's this at the heart of this social change from the 60s that these theorists are associated with is postmodernism. Postmodernism is difficult to define, perhaps by design, and it is a rejection of both modernism and modernity. So modernism and intellectual, like the previous dominant, or you might say hegemonic, intellectual zeitgeist, and modernity being the era of the modern period, basically, which is what, the 1500s to 1800s or something like that. Which began after the end of the Middle Ages, and in which we probably still live. And let's see. The definition. Yeah, so they, like you said, postmodernism raised such radical doubts about the structure of thought and society that it's ultimately a form of cynicism. They say that postmodernism has revolutionary beginnings. I think that struck me as strange because the rest of the book talks about how postmodernism was basically politically useless and it had to be transformed into something that had revolutionary or emancipatory potential. So I'm not sure, maybe they mean intellectually revolutionary. That would make more sense. And that it has evolved into new forms. This is one of my other problems with the book, is the focus on evolution, as it's like this, the memetics approach that's basically says that like ideas evolve, and it's just very like you can tell any story you want basically with that sort of approach. You can say that
This is
postmodernism
one of the
evolved,
areas where I think we've disagreed the most, which is whether Foucault influences someone like Robin DiAngelo. And I think it's worth
No, I
tracing
didn't
a
say he doesn't
genealogy.
influence her. I didn't say
Yeah,
that.
but I think that's sort of the worthwhileness of tracing the sort of mimetic genealogy, like because that's what we're discussing. We're discussing like the evolution of memes, and these memes of like being like radical skepticism of meta narratives are something that someone like DiAngelo really rejects. I mean, I think I told you that I thought her book White Fragility is sort of like a rewrite of Madness and Civilization, but about race.
Really? I mean, she doesn't focus a whole lot on history, and the focus is
maybe I'm giving it too much hyperbole there. How much I find it to be similar, and so yeah, that's
she's
probably
much
a
more
hyperbolic
radically
statement on my
prescriptive, whereas
part.
Foucault just wants to sort of break everything down.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
So but yeah, so I mean, just to be clear about my problem with the mimetic approach is that I would just much prefer them to say which thinkers influence whom and how and what exact pieces they do, which to some extent they do engage in that, but they have this sort of more sweeping narrative that like postmodernism didn't die, it evolved, and it's just rubs me as very spooky and strange to hear coming out of someone who is so anti-religion.
I mean, try to trace
like,
the origins of something like analytic philosophy. You can clearly trace it to some thinkers, but it's difficult to put your finger on like the exact genealogy of it. And it's something that's much more well established and followed than something like trends within postmodern thought. And analytic philosophy has also become much more like mainstream, and yet like we can kind of trace it back to like the 1890s and why am I forgetting some of the names of the people who introduced the Vienna
Frege.
Circle? Yeah, Frege and
Russell.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Gottlieb Frege
yeah,
was the one
you
that
can do
I was
that too, but it's
thinking
just
of.
I would, if somebody wanted to do it with analytic philosophy also, I would just be skeptical of this approach to ideas. Sort of, I mean, it's a kind of like the Jordan Peterson trope that he got from Jung, that ideas have
but
people rather
undoubtedly
than people
Frege
having ideas.
influences Bertrand Russell, who influences Wittgenstein, who influences Quine.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is a genealogy of those ideas. Like they do evolve into something.
Yeah.
Like,
well,
but to suggest that
like,
there's not that going on in postmodern
evolve,
thought is silly.
To say that the ideas evolve rather than like focusing on each thinker and how they differ and are similar with their predecessors is just the problem that I have.
Yeah, to step in for a second, like that's the thesis of the book, that there's this, history of postmodernism and it's evolved into, this identity, whatever, intersectional, more extreme version, whatever that they don't like today. That's like the thesis of the whole book. So you disagree? So with the thesis of the book.
Well,
so like,
I mean, I don't think that that the people that they talk about today have like that. None of them are influenced at all by any of the postmodern thinkers. I don't think that's true. Of course not. Right. But their thesis is that like. Go ahead.
But I mean, my point is like, how like, it is what it is. Like, it's not really. Like we can't like it seems like we keep on bringing it up. You disagree with the thesis of the book, and it's like, I don't like. It seems like with every single point we can't like keep on bringing up how you disagree with the thesis of the book.
Yeah, I feel like
Right,
another. I want to use the analytic philosophy metaphor again, or analogy, because this is like saying, like, okay, like the Vienna Circle is clearly like what we're thinking of when we think of logical positivism. Was Quine a positivist? Well, he wasn't quite a positivist. Was he a neo-positivist? Well, maybe. Like, what is a neo-positivist? Well, we don't really know what a neo-positivist is, but it's probably useful to categorize Quine as a neo-positivist to identify that he's part of analytical philosophical tradition related to positivism. And he's really, I think, as a project to try and rescue positivism from what were its obvious flaws that he caused for positivism. And obviously, I think some of these other thinkers are doing that with some of the trends in postmodern philosophy. And I think, I haven't finished it yet, but in chapter 1, they're doing all right. They're establishing that to my satisfaction.
And okay, I guess I wasn't clear because I have no issue with anything you just said. The problem that I take is the insistence that, I guess it would have to be the insistence that the 2 principles and the 4 themes that they identify with being the sort of core of postmodernism, that these are alive and well in all of the thinkers that they discuss throughout the rest of the book. That, I think, is and the only way, I guess, to explain, or the way that they do explain it, is that these ideas are like a virus that have gone on to infect future
So they use meme theory. I mean, that's just meme theory, sort of, but that like memes that are viral survive. And yeah, I'd say that these are rather viral memes. Like, I've run into them as a clinical therapist. Like, that's a weird place for these to show up. Like, they definitely seem to infect some of my patients. Some of the remnants of them filtering through the media infect my patients, and some of the remnants through academia infect my colleagues. Like, and in so as much as also like cognitive behavioral therapy infects them, and cognitive behavioral therapy is like comes from other memes like Stoicism, So I don't know. I don't get why it's unfair for them to have that viral like claim. But we haven't even outlined what
use it. I just think it's unscientific. We haven't even, but
that it's like unfalsifiable, or what?
I mean, essentially, yeah. It's like evolutionary psychology.
Is it falsifiable in that is my claim about Quine being a neo-positivist falsifiable?
Well, it's going to depend on how you define neo-positivism, of course, but
okay, so
if
obviously
if
these categories,
way, then,
these categories are how they're defining postmodernism, and we're going to try and see if some of these trends are in there, but we haven't even looked at like their definitions, which they really establish in chapter 1.
Right. So let's do that. So, okay.
But hang on, you called it, I'm still hung up on, you called it unscientific, but like any sort of taxonomy of things, any way we cut up the world is like, I mean, is it unscientific for being unfalsifiable to have this way of cutting up the world? Because obviously, like, are species unscientific? Well, we're all made of DNA. Like, do we really need divisions of species? Like, it's like, yeah, obviously we have different programs that we're using to analyze the world. So, and those programs themselves aren't like necessarily like directly falsifiable, but usually the predictions they make and how good they are, how progressive they are at being able to make predictions about the world. Do they predict new data? Like, I mean, this is all post-diction, though. They're tracing a genealogy. This is a work of history where they're cutting it up. So I don't know how you can like throw out it's not scientific and feel like that's a valid complaint there.
I was just talking about like meme theory, but
meme theory is not falsifiable.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't spent enough time with meme theory, but whatever.
So where are we? The difficulties with there's one thing I wanted to raise because I thought it was important. So yeah, since our ultimate focus is on the applied derivatives, this is bottom of 23 to 24. Since our ultimate focus is on the applied derivatives of postmodern thought that have become socially and culturally influential, even powerful today, this chapter will not attempt to survey the vast terrain of postmodernism, nor will it address the ongoing debate about which thinkers it is acceptable to call postmodernism and whether postmodernism is a meaningful term, or whether it would be better to separate the critics of postmodernity from the post-structuralists and those whose work is centered on the method of deconstruction. I don't know. I think if your thesis is that postmodernism has become the sort of postmodernism is at the heart of the culture war as it exists on the left, and there's people who are asking whether postmodernism is even a meaningful term, then maybe you should address that question.
But I mean, what if it's meaningless intentionally? Because that's how it seems to me. It seems to be
meaningless intentionally. In what sense? I mean, how could it be intentional if none of the postmodernists called themselves postmodernists, and only it was Lyotard who coined
and
the
hipsters
postmodern
never
condition?
call themselves hipsters. Like, does that mean there's no such thing as hipsters?
Yeah, Sam and I have had this discussion a long time because I take a more American pragmatist perspective on this, which, like, my favorite philosopher is William James, and a lot of people consider him postmodern, which is, it blows my mind because it makes me confused about what postmodern means. But I actually wrote down, like, my problem with this book is they shouldn't have titled this chapter Postmodernism. They should have titled it like What Postmodernism is Doing, or What Postmodernism Can Do. Because I feel like what he's doing to postmodernism is what he's done in the past to religion, which frustrates me. He takes something that religion does do and says that's all it does. That's the implication in what he's saying, to me anyway. I think.
Well, I think the problem is that the problem with him taking your advice here would be that he's not just telling us what postmodernism does. They are purporting to tell us what postmodernism is they're trying to define. They're offering a definition of the core tenets of postmodernism.
Okay, so let's remove it from that term for a moment. Like, because I think they could have written this chapter and instead of using this term, have called them like the Glom philosophers. And the Glom philosophers are influenced by Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard, and they have these ideas. They happen to use the term postmodernism, which is a highly contested term, but like if they'd used the Glom philosophers, and these are Glom ideas that have glommed on to other philosophers later on, like would that have made it more valid?
No, I mean, it wouldn't have made it more valid. I think what it would do is it would make their thesis of the book look a little less prima facie plausible. And when you get into the end,
if they use the term glom or if they use the term postmodern, it makes it less plausible.
It makes it less plausible if you use glom, because people tend to have these already typically negative, the people who would be reading this book, ideas about postmodernism that make it more attractive as a thesis to begin with.
I can't help but feel like...
So when you tell them that the far left social justice activists of today that all their ideas are derived from postmodernism, it's something that people are already inclined to believe.
I can't help but feel like postmodernism, whatever it may be, exposes itself to this exact flaw by refusing categorization. By refusing it, it's very hard for it to say.
Well, I mean, you're just talking about Derrida, right? I mean, does anyone else do that?
Well, the fact that we can't, like, the people who are postmodernists can't define it clearly, and the only thing that anybody can point to is Lyotard saying it's an incredulity to meta narrative, which I take serious issue with.
Postmodernism.
But that's what I mean. So if it's not going to be definable, then why does it need to be defendable? Like, what is the point of defending it if we don't know what it is that you're? If you're able to say explicitly what it is, then we can respond with, oh, okay, well then we can make a distinction between that and this. But by not giving itself a clear definition, I feel like it exposes itself to this inevitably.
I mean, here's something that's going to come up with my problem. One problem I have over and over again is this constant it to refer to postmodernism rather than he or she or they to refer to any of the thinkers themselves. They talk about postmodernism as though it's this like self-standing
It's just too individualistic for
the
me.
Virus,
That's
right?
just
They're talking about the meme.
You can't have a
They're talking about
movement.
Postmodernism.
I mean, there is a postmodern movement and a culture. Absolutely, there's no denying that. Pragmatically, it's easy to see, right? I mean, that's for sure. You can't see a movement as just individuals. It's like you can't look at water and be like, that's hydrogen and oxygen. No. It's water. It's a different thing.
But they're talking about their philosophy. They're talking about their theory, their work, right? And in this chapter, right, they're not talking about like, I mean, they talk briefly about like the history that led up to it and the sort of dissatisfaction with attempts at Marxism and the Second World War and all these things. But when they're talking about postmodernism's view on reality or something like that, they should be giving us examples and citing the people who wrote the stuff that they're calling.
Let's get into as they come up. Let's get into some of the specific instances where they don't cite. But as far as like, I think we could go for hours on like whether they get postmodernism right the same way people can go for hours and perhaps years in the media fighting what is and what isn't fascism. So fascism is a definition with an opposite polarity, like, you know, sort of an opposite political polarity, where postmodernism feels very leftist and fascism feels very rightist. And neither of them are easily defined. Many of them claim that many people on the other side of the aisle claim that the other person's being postmodern, neo-Marxist, or fascist. You know, so it's just like, these are stupid terms, and we should accept that people are defining their terms differently, and we ought to accept that, okay, they're defining postmodernism in a certain way, they're going to continue to use it in the way. Let's see at least if they're consistent using it in the way that they intend for it to be used in chapter 1.
This illustrates my point. There's a comment in the chat from somebody here who is to support Sam, and it says, maybe read a better book that defines it better. And my point is, but what book do I read? I mean, where is this definition? Because it seems to be every time we talk about a definition, we end up in a conversation about how there is no good definition, and how the lack of a definition to me feels like rhetorical warfare. It feels like a tactic to prevent the same criticism it's levying on everybody else.
I think I have to agree with Jimmy here. Like, he's right. There's a general phenomenon. Like, this is a common thing I run into a lot. Is like, what did the founders believe, right? In American politics, there's often this idea of like, this was what the founders intended. There were a couple hundred founders, you know, depending on how you want to count it, right? Several dozen at the least, and they represented all the way up to the tip of New England to the subtropical South. They were merchants and slave owners and farmers, and scholars and architects. They were all sorts of people. They had a variety of views. Some of them were fans of federalism. Some of them were anti-federalist. Some of them were conservative, liberal, libertarian, what have you. A lot of people will try and say, this is what the founders believed. And they'll, cite, one or two prominent founders who had this view. And you can cite one or two prominent founders that had different views. Now, the thing is, what unifies them is they had a lot of things in common, even among their own divisions. And so the general philosophy of the American Revolution that informs American politics today, that makes American politics with its left-right divisions different than other countries with its left-right divisions, is still true. Like, there are things where I'm influenced by divergent thinkers like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, even if I'm not following each of them to a T. And there's an extent to where the postmodernists, as we call them in this big collective, are influenced by the various thoughts and writings of these postmodern, figures that they've cited, even if it's not to a T, and even if it's not like a perfect, straightforward understanding of each, because it's more of a general thing. I mean, it's like there's similarities in postmodern philosophy and politics that it has with like postmodern art even. There's a certain way the postmodern way of thinking goes. Like, not just rejecting modernism, but the features of modernism. The systemization, the sophisticated systemization that came with modernism in just about every discipline. And postmodernism has been sort of like an unraveling of that, a questioning of that, an inversion of that.
The only unifying characteristics of postmodernism I have found are the criticisms of meta-narrative.
It's a very difficult thing to do, and it's a thing where the borders of postmodernism can be fuzzy, but the nucleus is very dense. And I think as long as we have that, we can proceed.
Also,
All right.
it's like, all right, can you get it like get postmodernism, like get it like, you know, like 50%, like give us like a 50% right, or get it like also the thing
That's
you
a
can
good
complain
point.
about this the entire book is that it's not that long, like 35 pages, and you know you're going over like, you know, the most famous, you know, postmodernism, and it's trying to explain us, you know, and summarize them in 35 pages. It's kind of short, and I think you could make that criticism about the rest of the book. It's like kind of short.
I don't think the problem is its length. That's not the problem I have, at least.
I like this comment. Defining post-modernity versus post-modernism is useful on this point. I kind of agree. There's a distinction to be made there. My criticisms are more with like postmodernism, because every time I've tried to discuss it or critique it, the only things I can find that are universal in it is a resistance to anything universal, and no matter what I do say, somehow I've critiqued it wrong. Like there just doesn't seem to be.
What?
There just does every critique is sort of like, well, that's not really postmodernism. That's
I don't think so.
How?
Because I mean, as we're using it here, postmodernism, skepticism about meta narratives.
Yeah, but I don't want to go into that. But I think that is a meta narrative.
No. Well, then you're using a different definition of meta narrative.
But why should so not everyone should then?
What do you mean?
Not everybody should critique meta narratives, or sometimes meta narratives shouldn't be critiqued.
Where'd you get? How is that the what?
Well, if it's not universal, then there must be a counterexample where there's a meta narrative that's not worthy of critique. Or is it universal that all meta narratives should be critiqued?
They're not. Their skepticism is about meta narratives. They're not positively necessary. They might be, right? But just to be skeptical about meta narratives doesn't entail that they're telling people to be skeptical about meta narratives.
No, but they're making. I mean, you don't have to tell people. The moral of a fairy tale isn't telling people you have to do something. It's saying you should. And I feel the same way about this. If there is no critique,
it's not logically entailed by the view. Like the view could be skepticism about meta narratives without being people who read me should also take away the skepticism about meta narratives.
So a world where there was zero skepticism of all meta narratives would be perfectly fine.
That is a different question.
Why?
So,
because I'm just trying.
You're now asking a moral question, and they're not giving you a moral. They're not doing they're not giving you moral answers. That's not.
So they would say maybe. So the answer would be maybe it's not for me to decide.
Maybe that would be the answer. I don't know what the answer would be. That we can't go ask them. So. Okay, before we're almost at them actually like starting to tell us what postmodernism is in the book. They tell us that postmodernism is particularly skeptical of
what page are you reading
science. From? Where was it? I just lost it. Okay, it's page 25.
Okay.
The last paragraph. They say postmodernism was particularly skeptical of science and other culturally dominant ways of legitimizing claims as truths, and of the grand sweeping explanations that supported them. It called them meta-narratives, right? And so here it's true, they're giving a good classification of meta-narratives, but they're also saying that postmodernists included science. Now, as far as I know, none of the postmodernists included science itself as a meta-narrative. As far as I know, they saw science and different bodies of science as narratives that for a long time relied on this sort of enlightenment learner autonomous, like intellectual autonomous ideal of the truth seeker. And so it was on the Enlightenment meta narrative that the sciences had rested for a while to justify themselves. And I think it is true that sciences themselves, at least as most people see the sciences, rely on a meta narrative to be meaningful to some extent, right? Like if you have no meta narrative that says that, like, if you don't believe in like materialism or dualism, then it's hard to know what the sciences mean to you, right? Like you need an underlying metaphysical framework to take meaning from a specific scientific discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have it, then all you get is a sort of descriptive view of the scientific world that says, like, look, we see these patterns, and these patterns can help us predict the future more or less reliably, and we like to make predictions, and so like we're going to keep doing science and it's valuable. There's a difference between saying that and saying science is like giving us an insight into the basic nature of reality. Now that second one is what rests on a meta narrative, whereas the first one I don't think does. And so, I mean, I looked through Leotard. I didn't find any skepticism about science I didn't see science as a meta narrative. I don't see anything in Foucault that says like the sciences themselves can be seen as a meta narrative. I see him genealogizing and doing an archaeology of specific human sciences, which sort of suggest a skepticism toward them.
Science would be like, they would say like, well, what about the atomic bomb? Like, you guys were so smart, you found, more ways to kill more people. Like, with these, talented.
Are you talking about like
physics people?
Like,
I think there.
Are you talking about any of the thinkers themselves?
I think Foucault would. That's stuff that Foucault would say.
Is this just like a prediction about how Foucault would respond?
If he says stuff like that, like he says that, like
But he says what? Like that because there's the atomic bomb that science is bad? Or like what?
He says like because what the atomic bomb would like the destruction it could cause, like how do we know that how do we know that was right for us to, the science was right for us to pursue? I'm not explaining it well, but he says kind of stuff like this that we're talking about. I guess I should think of a.
But that right? No, that's fair. Like it might be true that he says that, but that's not calling science a meta narrative.
Wait, he literally calls, in the order of things, he establishes the term episteme, which is about defining the conditions of possibility of all knowledge and how culture invests the episteme of a culture is what the culture defines as what could be true and false, what may or may not be. Like we end up calling the episteme in the West science, and like I don't know, I don't see how. Most of Foucault's work is around radical skepticism around the systems of power within society. So if we have a system of power we call episteme, you don't think Foucault encourages radical skepticism towards what is knowable about the primary means of knowing in society, which we call science, which is the dominant episteme.
I don't think Foucault would say that he sees science itself as a meta-narrative the way that we understand the term science.
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about science as a method of reliable means of getting knowledge, or whether you're talking about science as a cultural activity within the West. It sounds like you're saying Foucault is skeptical of the latter and endorses the former.
Say that again.
I think he's skeptical of both of them. I honestly
Yeah.
do.
It
Did
could
you read
be,
Foucault?
actually, with
Skep?
episteme, yeah,
Short, just like short essays of his, and mainly like interviews.
So I could see there like the classification of an episteme as a meta-narrative, but all of Foucault's like as we'll see their discussion of him later in The Order of Things, the three sciences, he calls them sciences, that he focuses on are linguistics, economics, and what was the other one? Biology. And so, and again, in other work, he makes it explicitly clear that he didn't intend what he says about the relationship, or I mean, he didn't intend to suggest, for instance, that what theoretical physicists are doing or that what mathematicians are doing are like completely determined by the power structures, whereas his discussion of the human sciences seems to give off more of that. So I mean, just like,
I think there is reason to like be skeptical of like science, like, and just not like
yeah,
believe
right,
like, you know,
yeah, there's reason to be
everything
skeptical
that,
of
like,
it, pretty much
experts say.
everything.
Right.
we're all just brains and vats, man. Yeah, they get into some more of this later, and I think I even talked to you about how they have an interesting quote about, they have an interesting citation where they discuss some of the philosophy of science in their endnotes. But because I had questioned coming into this whether they were familiar with some of the philosophers of science that I found pretty valuable, because I do think there are times where they make a broad defense of liberalism, capitalism, or science, and I kind of wonder, okay, like what liberalism are you talking about? What are you talking about? What do you mean with science? Like, do you have a grounding in like sort of like, I mean, with science, philosophy of science, it gets obnoxious. You've got the demarcation problem, what is and what isn't science. And like fighting over that has been a big philosophical battle that most scientists aren't familiar with and don't give a fuck about. And yet there still is this practice we call science. The philosophers of science are fighting over with the demarcation problem. But I think we're so early into chapter 1, we need to kind of like get into it.
Yeah. So they keep going. 26, talking about the sort of skepticism about meta narratives. They talk about Lacan and Baudrillard. So this one thing I found weird was they discuss Baudrillard, page 26 and 27, and so Baudrillard has this idea of the simulacra.
It's the Matrix
like
book. It's the book The Matrix was heavily influenced by.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's actually the book that at the beginning that he takes the stuff out of. It's cut out.
So they say in the postmodern period there is no original and all is simulacra, which are unsatisfactory imitations and images of the real. Baudrillard referred to the state as the hyperreal. Then he says this evinces the postmodernist tendency to seek the roots of meaning in language and to become overly concerned with the ways in which it shapes social reality through its ability to constrain and shape knowledge. I don't see the relation between just the idea of simulacra and this being like clear evidence of how the postmodernists are obsessed with language.
Where are you?
I see. Top of 27.
Top of 27.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of the like the tendency to seek the roots of meaning in language has to do so much more with like structuralism and post-structuralism, who I know that like the structuralists really influence the postmodernists, and it's like the where you cut between post-structuralism and postmodernism is totally fuzzy. Is that like, you know, again, that's not a debate we need to get into.
Yeah, so I just thought that was strange that they used this as their evidence, not as their only evidence, but that they say this evinces the postmodernist tendency to seek the roots of meaning in language and to become overly concerned with the ways in which it shapes social reality through it. Because to me, when I think of Baudrillard, I think about like television and like consumer culture and just sort of like late stage capitalism stuff. But
you think of Baudrillard as a cultural commentator rather than a commentator on the philosophy of language.
That's, yeah, I mean, that seems to me like the most straightforward understanding. I mean, I haven't read his book, but like, and how I've seen it discussed, and we briefly talked about it in class on Marx, it seems to be.
I was kind of curious what they were trying to do with this section called the Roots, Principles, and Themes of Postmodernism. Like right before they get to, because on page 28, they go through 3 different people's definitions, but before that, they're summarizing sort of the thinkers that they're calling postmodernists before getting even into the definition. I thought it was just awkward that they even like structured it like this. So I don't even know why pages 24 through 28 have this long section that's just like, it's like almost trying to show off their chops, like, oh, by the way, we've read these guys. And it's sort of like, yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with you that like, I'm not sure all their summaries are great and right.
Yeah, we're like 7 pages in. We've heard about postmodernism already, and then they say, what though is postmodernism?
Yeah, then suddenly on
like,
28, it's just awkward. They say, by the way, what is postmodernism? And we're like, wait,
yeah,
I don't know. Did they just feel like they had to separate that from the line on 24 where they said they wouldn't try and address the ongoing debate about whether postmodernism is meaningful? And then they define it a few pages later, like kind of forget that earlier part we said about whether or not it's a meaningful term. Like,
it's like a disingenuous footnote in an academic paper. It's like, oh, like, you know, this is beyond the scope of the presidential career.
Yeah, it will be left as an exercise to the reader. Like,
yeah. So then we get, okay, so they tell us what is postmodernism. They start with the Encyclopedia Britannica definition that says, I mean, let's not even go all the way into it. Then they do Walter Truett Anderson, the 4 pillars. One thing I wanted to bring up here when they talk about relativism. So Anderson, talking about relativism, he stresses this is relativism not in the sense of being non-judgmental, but in the sense of believing that all forms of morality are socially constructed cultural worldviews. So those are very different claims. One is to claim that, like, oh, we shouldn't judge any other culture because every culture is just as good as every other. The other is not necessarily claiming anything about whether we can judge, but just pointing out that what a culture believes is socially constructed to some degree. So that'll come up later. Talks about deconstruction in art and culture and globalization. Then they say, okay, so this is the Steiner-Cavell part. This part I found problematic, as my fellow wokesters like to say.
Dude, so you've been going to college recently. Wow.
They say Steiner-Cavell, who is professor of psychology and director of the Center of Qualitative Research, the central themes of postmodernism include doubting that any human truth provides an objective representation of reality. Okay, fair. Focusing on language and the ways society use it to create their own local realities and denying the universal. These, he explains, resulted in an increased interest in narrative and storytelling, particularly when truths are situated within particular cultural constructs, and a relativism that accepts that different descriptions of reality cannot be measured against one another in any final, that is, objective way. I think that last point sounds pretty accurate as a portrayal of postmodernism, is that, look, there's no sort of non-human epistemic God's eye view that we can transcend to and verify as like a truly objective way of seeing the world. That sounds like a postmodernist claim to me, at least the sorts of thinkers that they're talking about. They would say, like, at least if that's true, I could see how one would get that from the thinkers. But then and then I also just want to point out in the end notes here, they actually give page numbers to Steiner Cavell's work. Then the next paragraph, they say the key observation following Cavell. They seem to be building off this and giving their own analysis based on what Cavell has said, is that the postmodern turn brought about an important shift away from the modernist dichotomy between the objective universal and the subjective individual, and toward local narratives and the lived experiences of their narrators. In other words, the boundary between that which is objectively true and that which is subjectively experienced ceased to be accepted. I don't know about that claim. That seems to be suggesting that, like, and I mean, there's more about that. There's more on this in the future. Is again, like,
are you saying that
neglecting the
Cavell
distinction
doesn't
between-
state this, or that postmodernists are not radical subjectivists?
I mean, it would depend what you mean by radical subjectivism. But I'm saying that
What I mean by radical subjectivism is that there is, like, we cannot know what's objectively true, and that we have to accept merely our subjective experience. No, I know that's not what I mean by radical subjectivism.
not
It's that,
merely. Right.
So, yeah, it's not that we only merely have our subjective experience, because that might just be skepticism. But a radical skepticism, subjectivism might be that, like, the subjective beliefs shape our reality, like, in a way that is more significant than external factors. Internal factors shape our reality in a more significant way than external factors. Yeah, I'm doing a poor job of explaining what I mean by radical subjectivism. I mean, I think of people who really heavily endorse standpoint theory, where it's like, you can't know things about, like, you cannot know the things in the world that I know based on your lived experience. Like, that seems to be like the knowability of certain knowledge is being impossible if you have a different standpoint. Seems to be a radical subjectivism, as in, like, not as there not only no objective truth that, like, everyone can access. There's not this universalism of the ability to get at truth, but, like, there is this subjective experience that both constructs and allows one to know any sort of truth, the only truth that is knowable. And our subjective experiences and beliefs sort of shape those views. And some of these subjective experiences are unhavable by people with certain social positions. I don't know. That's at least what I think of when I think of standpoint theory. But
right. I don't think that any of the thinkers that they're talking about in this section would embrace that, at least as definitely, I don't think would embrace standpoint theory. But
well, I don't think standpoint theory existed in the 60s, unless you're saying it has a bigger intellectual genealogy. I'm not totally sure about.
Right. Yeah, I think it started with Lukács. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but it started as a Marxist thing before it became a feminist thing. And so I don't remember when that came about, but to me, what they smuggled in here, I think, is that they're talking about objective truth rather than objective knowledge. They say, in other words, the boundary between that which is objectively true and that which is subjectively experienced ceased to be accepted. The postmodernists, there's nothing that there's no reason they can't say, look, there's an objective truth. We have no idea what it is. And our subjective experiences are like any knowledge we come up with is going to ultimately be a product of our subjective experiences. It's not going to be, you can't have knowledge that is unmediated by subjective experience. I mean, that seems just true to me, but
yeah, I don't know if who's objecting to the idea that you can't have knowledge that is not mediated by subjective experience. I don't think anyone objects to that, as far as I know.
Yeah, because I don't know how you could. And this is something that I come back to a lot, that I heard Noam Chomsky say when he was asked about postmodernism. And he says, there isn't anything in postmodernism that is he said anything in postmodernism is either trivially true or false. And I think this is one of those things that's trivially true. And I think that a lot of the the more radical interpretation is based on an assumption that it's saying something that goes beyond what is really just like kind of a trivial truth that might be disguised in some obscurantist language.
Yeah,
but then they say, what's up?
Do you see so I'm looking at the first definition of postmodernism, because on 28 and 29 we have these three different sources for definitions of postmodernism. We have Walter Truett Anderson, Encyclopedia Britannica, and Steiner Quine. And then on page 31 we have Lindsay and Pluckrose's definition. And one of the things that I imagined you would critique was whether Lindsay and Pluckrose's definition flows out of these definitions that they establish on 28 and 29. Where, do you think that, because they claim stuff like cultural relativism is one of the themes of postmodernism, where is that the same?
But when they cite it above, they don't cite the same kind of cultural relativism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Britannica's the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. I can sort of start to connect where ideology is obviously something in these frameworks that's worthy of critique. It's something that supports mainstream culture. So is that a cultural relativism? Sort of. It's sort of like a skepticism.
But I mean, in the next one, is explicit that the kind of relativism isn't non-judgmental.
All forms of morality are socially constructed cultural worldviews. Yeah, I mean, that's just saying
that's more like a constructivism than a relativism.
Yeah, well, and yeah, I mean, I think the consequence of taking that is you say, yeah, they're all socially constructive. There is no moral realism. There is no morality we can reference to say something is good or bad. There's merely our culturally constructed moral frameworks. And as a moral realist, I disagree, but I don't know whether you feel like they're misconstruing this postmodern trend as saying one of the defining features is cultural relativism.
Yeah, we'll get to that, and I do think that it's, at least as they go on to talk about cultural relativism, it's a misconstrual. I think cultural constructivism, that's a pretty postmodernist view.
I mean, they say Cavalli. They say Cavalli is on page 18 of his work Themes, that he says that relativism that accepts that different descriptions of reality cannot be measured against one another in a final objective way. Society, yeah, I can't tell.
But that's not really a relativism.
Cultural relativism.
I don't know if I would call that a relativism.
Relativism for the value of different cultures. Can we really say that one culture is better or worse than another? No. Can we really say that a culture is doing something wrong?
Yeah, right. Relativism is usually relativism about moral judgments or
claims. I mean, the example that I hear over and over from someone in the IDW is when Sam Harris talks about having a conversation with one of Obama's ethicists, or she was he refers to it as he talked to this bioethicist. She'd just given a talk, and she was a total moral relativist, believe that you can't really judge other cultures. And he said, let's say a culture has a belief that they blind every third child. They just, would that be wrong? And she's kind of miffing. She's not really allowing herself to be pinned down on it. And he said, well, what about if they had it as a religious belief that they said every third should walk in blindness? And she was like, well, then we could never say that they are wrong. And that seems to be a moral cultural relativism that's I don't know. I definitely see that in my friends who call themselves postmodern therapists. I definitely see how you can come to that conclusion after reading someone like Foucault. You can tell that Foucault is one of the ones that I'm more familiar with. But yeah, his criticisms of the West seem to lead me to that. Yeah, why should I accept this? The primacy of the West. Why should I accept that the West has any more civilization than any other part of the world? Why should I think of this? The brutality that we accept is all right. Reed, you didn't know that they're postmodern therapists? There's whole schools of postmodern therapy.
What are the feeling that they make their patients more distressed?
I mean, I think that, but most other therapists think they make their patients better.
so someone could be a relativist and think that, but I think that's in no way an entailment of relativism. I think the more defensible kind of relativism is one that's like, it would basically say like there's no outside of my worldview way that I can like really say that there's anything wrong with that practice, but my moral worldview says that that's clearly wrong, and so of course I can condemn that culture, because I think that like my morality tells me to preach equality, and just like every third person who's born blinding them clearly does not respect the principle of equality. And that's a more popular kind of relativism in philosophy, at least.
I'm trying to still understand whether they're even, because I think a lot of their argument will hinge on this idea that postmodernism contains the theme of cultural relativism. And now I'm just looking at their 4 major themes on 31. So that's part of why I'm even like sticking on it myself, is I think that's a major claim for them. And I kind of agree with that interpretation. Because I think, the rest of their book is going to hinge on, like, if postmodernism, one of the themes is that we can identify as cultural relativism, and we identify it in all these different places, then, we can kind of identify this genealogy and also be able to critique it en masse.
It should be noted that that's one of, like, the main dunks people have against postmodernism is cultural relativism. But in this short chapter, they don't really mention it that much.
They give like a paragraph on it.
Right.
But one thing I want to point to real quick that I was trying to get to from Cavale is that when they're elaborating on it in the paragraph following the paragraph where they actually cited his work, they say that the perception of society as formed of individuals interacting with universal reality in unique ways was replaced by multiple allegedly equally valid knowledges and truths. So it's they get from this the claim that all knowledges and truths are equally valid. Well, I mean, if you're defining knowledge in terms of truth and you have like a coherent conception of truth, then of course they're like all equally valid because they're all true. But you need for this to be a problem, you need there to be like a relativist conception of truth that I just don't think that the postmodernists have. In terms of, I don't, and because of that, I don't see why why the postmodernists would claim that all knowledges are equally valid. I think the kind of relativism about knowledge that it would make sense to attribute to them would be a lot closer to the kind of moral relativism I was just describing. Because all of these postmodernists were very like politically active, and they cared about serious things. They had moral views. So it wouldn't make any sense if they were just indiscriminate relativists who thought that pretty much all views were just as good as any other views. I think how they would probably, if they were to sort of psychoanalyze themselves, they would say, look, I understand that the reason that I have the moral and political beliefs that I have, is because of the environment that I grew up in and the social influences on me as a kid and my parents and the people I interacted with at school and all these things and other cultural influences that explain why I have the moral and political views that I have. But that doesn't mean that I think that all other views are just as equally okay as my views. Of course, I think my views are correct because they're my views.
Yeah, I mean, as you're describing that, you're also describing that, I think, pretty well from like how a postmodernist might describe it. Like, sure, I gain these values from society and I'm going to value them, but that doesn't mean they're like totally valueless. It's probably likely that I'm onto something. But, and like, I think a postmodernist, one of the themes is also going to be that social constructivism, that I'm primarily the product of my environment. But that again leads to a cultural relativism because it doesn't suggest a moral realism, some sort of shared morality that we agree on. And I think that's part of why there's stuff like evolutionary biology that really grinds people's gears, who are sort of in this, who are cultural relativists, who are in that sort of landscape, because something like evolutionary psychology is going to claim that like game theory and reciprocal trading is going to be part of the underlying features of any evolved creatures that are trying to survive. So and that seems to assume also like an origin, that we all have this shared origin. It assumes a universalism that is something that's rejected by postmodernism. I think we have good reason to reject it. I think there's also good reason to identify this as a description of the world where, yeah, they're into social constructivism, which is sort of entailed in Lindsay and Pluckrose's number 4, the loss of the individual and the universal. And I think they expand on that later. Where like you'll even see something like D'Angelo in her chapter on White Woman's Tears say that emotions are culturally constructed, and that like when you experience emotions, it has to do with when society told you to experience emotions, and when society told you it was okay, and when society rewarded you for experiencing emotions. Like, and I sorry, my cat's got his toy. He always meows when he's got his toy in his mouth.
But no, I think that what you said is right. I think one of the weak points of postmodernism for sure would be it can't accommodate for like the universals that biology posits, because the skepticism,
I think that identifies. Sorry, go ahead. I'm interrupting you.
The kinds of skepticism about science that the postmodernists, particularly Foucault, had were about the human sciences, and biology was included. And I think if he threw the baby out with the bathwater anywhere, it was probably in the human sciences. He thought that, you know, because these things are culturally constructed, which they are, like the way we practice biology is a product of culture. Of like, you just can't deny that. Like the way that we practice everything is a product of culture. It's not exclusively a product of culture, and that's the problem. Is that Foucault can't recognize inherent biological universals of human beings who are biological beings.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that end up getting rejected are that there might be more or less reliable ways to get knowledge, and that the more reliable ways are things that we might end up grouping together, and sometimes loosely and inaccurately referring to as science, and that those things might be more valid ways of knowing than other ways of knowing. But I think that's something largely that is a theme that postmodernism would reject. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't see why they have to claim that any form of knowledge from any culture is just as good as any other.
You're saying that postmodernists do say that, don't say that, or
I'm saying I don't see why they have to say that, because like
well, how do they avoid a meta narrative?
The cultural constructivism doesn't lead to them having to say, oh yeah, and so I just can't judge anything. They're just saying, look, I can judge these things, and I like deeply believe that my judgments in these things are correct. I just don't think that I'm transcending my like the influences that have led me to have these sorts of standards. Like I'm not transcending my cultural episteme or whatever.
Yeah, I guess I wonder where there's a difference between literally what Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard said, and what postmodernism is in practice today, that seem to actually, like, I would agree with Lindsay and Pluckrose that when I even see people like postmodern therapists, I do think they're influenced by people like the sort of radical skepticism of meta-narratives that come out of someone like Foucault. And these people also really endorse cultural relativism, which is like, I mean, they're full in on that, like, we can't say that another way of being is worse or better. Like, it's really hard to say if someone else is like beating their kids, that's the wrong way to do it. Like, sure, I might be ethically constrained by the constraints of my license to report them if they're leaving marks on their children when they beat them, but who am I to tell them that it's wrong? Like, I mean, I think that is something that we get generations down from Foucault, even if maybe he can't be nailed down on that. exactly. But I think there are some situations where, yeah, his general skepticism of the value of the West can lead us to sort of this state of like epistemic confusion. Like, if I ought to be skeptical of the things that we call good, like the West and science and like modern medicine, then like, how can I really say that other cultures are doing it wrong? I don't know. I see these things flowing out of one another in practice, although perhaps you're saying, they're not really nailing them down in academic philosophy. This is what Foucault actually says.
Yeah, I think they're clearly nowhere giving us reason to think that I don't think they cite any evidence that supports the attribution of the claim that all knowledges or all moralities or all cultures are equally valid. I think
so
you're
saying that's not something postmodernists think.
Well, it depends which postmodernists we're talking about, but I don't know. But I haven't seen any reason to attribute that to Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, or Baudrillard.
So you think that Walter Truett's Anderson definition doesn't apply to Lyotard, Foucault, or Derrida?
Well, Walter Truett, that's the one where he says relativism, not in the sense of non-judgment, but in the sense of constructivism.
Yeah, I mean,
think that's right. That sounds right.
Yeah, I get that there's a distinction by like, we each have our moral standard that we end up judging other people by that. And like whether or not you're a moral realist, whether there's actually like standards outside ourselves that we can say make things good or bad. But I kind of, it feels like a distinction without a difference to me. Like, if you really acknowledge that each of us just construct our own moralities, then you by definition can only reference your own, and then who are you to tell me that mine's better or worse, except from your own experience? You can't really speak for something that's like a greater moral thing. Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, no one cares if you're you, but like, I feel like there are statements to be made from a morality that is real, and that would not qualify me as a postmodernist. Like, being a moral realist disqualifies you. And I think many of these postmodernists, like, I don't know. Yeah, I end up. It's
like, it is a serious philosophical point, is that you can be a relativist without like claiming that all views are just as equally valid as any other views. And as far as I know, there are no relativists who seriously think that that's true. Like, all the relativists I've seen and read have made that like a crucial feature of their theory. Like, hey, look, I'm not claiming this.
Yeah. Should we move on to later pages? I actually have places where I think they lack citations on page 34, 36, 37, 38, 40, 41.
So let's just first get the points on the page. So the principles and the themes.
Dude,
so that's
we're 2 hours deep. No one's listening anymore. We've all read this already. No one's.
I want to hear Eric's where they lack citations.
Yeah.
All right, Sam, if you had something to say.
I mean, let me see.
If we wanted to summarize our audience, we're way past that. Yeah.
So this is the point I wanted to make clear, Eric, about how you raised the distinction between truth being objective and our knowledge of the truth being objective. And you said like they clarify this later on, and they do at one point towards the end, but on page 30 they say it's the last paragraph of the first sentence where they say reality is ultimately the product of our socialization and lived experiences as constructed by systems of language.
Sorry, that's on page 30?
Page 30, top of the page, last sentence of the first paragraph. For postmodernism, reality, by contrast, reality is ultimately the product of our socialization and lived experiences as constructed by systems of language. I haven't seen any postmodernism claim that. Any postmodernists claim that this is reality, this is what reality is. Typically, they're skeptical about our possibility to talk about reality.
It's all language.
Yeah, I don't know. I know.
I was actually wondering about that because like language is really, really important, right? Like every marketing and everyone acknowledges it. Like even for people that can see like, Black Lives Matter doesn't actually mean, isn't just about Black Lives Matter and they have, this ulterior agenda, etc., etc. Even like for like us, people that can see that, even the fact that they have their name Black Lives Matter still means something. Like as if they had like another name, like so like language is really, really important. So so it's hard even for me to see like when does it become not important. So like I do like
Well,
agree with like
right.
the postmodernists a lot that like it's really, really important. So it's hard for me to say like what is it?
Right. I
Where is
think
the
everyone
truth
can
beyond
acknowledge
the
that language is
language?
important, but what they seem to be attributing to the postmodernists here is that language is like a fundamental building block of reality, and it's basically just like language and culture and lived experiences that constitute reality. Versus what they claim 2 pages later, they clarify that cultural constructivism is not the belief that reality is literally created by cultural beliefs. It doesn't argue, for instance, that when we erroneously believed the sun went around the earth, our beliefs had any influence over the solar system and its dynamics. So then why are you telling us that the postmodernists believe that reality is literally created by culture? 2 pages earlier.
Yeah, what does it mean? Like, there is a valid cultural perspective. I will and I have and I will hear it again that postmodern therapists argue this, where they say there is a valid perspective that the sun goes around the earth. Who are you to say that it doesn't? From this perspective, like they'll appeal to relativity, that things are all like that you have to measure things from a relative standpoint in the universe. When they talk about the power of language, they will appeal to the social psychology experiments that show that that cultures that define green and blue differently will be able to perceive shades differently and distinguish shades that some cultures cannot distinguish. They'll appeal to Eskimos' ability to distinguish different types of snow and different types of frozen ice to different degrees. And it's like there is this, like, it comes back to that principle that Chomsky had, which is that, like, yeah, they're either trivially true claims or just outright false. And I think part of this is that I really do think that they're hitting on something that, like, there is this very difficult to pin down thing that we call postmodernism. And it really has influenced other philosophical schools. And some of the things that are like, it's tough because you're also talking about, like, is this a necessary trait of postmodernism? And it's like,
or just
yeah,
do
it's
any of them
really
say
hard to
this?
pin down. It's really hard to pin down exactly what the epistemological claims of postmodernists are, but there are certainly some significant epistemological claims because of the radical skepticism they espouse, even if they can't exactly, like, they don't exactly pin down what their epistemological claims are. I don't know. Am I making any sense on this, or am I still vague?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you said about, like, you pointed out a serious problem in the reasoning of the postmodern therapists that you know. I just don't see any of that in the postmodernists. I don't see the postmodernists saying it's, that's a valid.
So you don't think in
the
madness
postmodernists are under
civilization,
discussion here.
you don't think that Foucault is saying, who are we to say who is mad? Madness is merely a game of power where people are trying to reject other ways of being that are just as valid if we didn't have these social constructs.
He may be saying that, but there's a distinction between saying that and saying these claims about the social sciences and about psychology. Then
that's a psychological
especially
claim.
at the point where society had developed the sciences as they were while Foucault was alive, versus saying it's okay, it's totally valid to say that the sun goes around the earth.
I'm saying that there is an ongoing project growing out of this of radical skepticism of the sciences, especially the humanities, and valuing of individual and social and culturally situated perspectives over things like well-established frameworks that we might call scientific knowledge. And that seems to me to be one of the qualifying features of postmodernism.
There's actually somebody in the
I
chat
just want to understand
talking about
Eric's point better. Are you saying that general statement, well, not general, but not general, it's actually that specific type of statement by Foucault is basically the seed that germinated into broader applications that we're seeing by the postmodern left, and for that reason, it's an issue, and it's not also a non sequitur relationship between Foucault and the postmodern left. That in fact, this is why they're doing it. It's because they read him, and they're like, well, if you can do it for this, why not this? And you're saying
I think that's essentially the claim that I'm making, that Foucault established a mode of cultural critique where we appeal to the sort of power that language plays in constructing things like who is mad, who isn't, what is reality, what isn't, what is knowable, what isn't.
It's similar to how while Martin Luther King had different beliefs than a lot of the postmodern left, a lot of them have nevertheless inherited the activist mantle that he sort of created the archetype for.
King isn't woke enough for them. I don't know where you're getting this from.
I was saying they're King
is up against the wall with the rest of them.
So they're drawing all these influences. They're extracting bits. There's extracting an activist bit there, and then they're extracting that skeptical relativist bit from Foucault, and all these different extractions together are making this soup of postmodernism that we're coming to understand, and that apparently provoked James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose into writing this book.
I don't know. I think that's pretty fair.
Somebody in the chat is describing their experience with postmodern therapy and how much they benefit from it. Oh man, Eric left.
Oh, he accidentally went into the other general
there
chat.
It is. So somebody in the
clicked on general.
I'm curious because you're a clinical therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody in the chat is talking about their experience with postmodern therapy, and they're praising it quite a bit. And I'm going to read to you what they said, because I asked, there was a little conversation, and I asked to ask them to describe it and why they find it useful. And they said, essentially, in the same way that postmodernism said, let's try something other than climb another mountain. And I said, so accept defeat. And they say, let's try something other than the diagnoses, going through your whole story. No, the opposite. So one of the postmodern, sorry if I'm going on too long. One of the therapies is called solution-focused therapy. Most therapy is
very familiar with solution-focused.
Is problem-focused. So I said, I can't see why you wouldn't need both, and I can't understand why focus on solutions would be postmodernist. Then they described it, and I start to get it. Clients come to counseling. Yeah. This doesn't sound solution-focused to me personally. Clients come to counseling with what narrative therapy, another postmodernist therapy, calls problem-saturated narratives. The problem narrative is important, but as where many traditional therapies you can go 5 years, I'm confused what that means. Only to find out, finally locate the problem in the relationship with your parents or whatever. The postmodernist therapist will try to move in a different way than this. So you will ask questions that are I'm having trouble reading how this is written. So you will ask questions that are trying to get a shift in thinking. It's hard to explain briefly, but essentially you don't see yourself as the expert in your client's life. That is another big feature. You instead try to ask questions that get the client to surface their own solutions. I mean, that sounds reasonably okay to ask questions, trying to get people to feel like that's
I don't think that postmodern therapy is an ineffective therapy. But that also has to do with what are effective therapies. And this is one of my hobby horses, is that the research on psychotherapeutic outcomes. And there are actually very clear criteria that we really do need to meet for a therapy to be effective. Or at least we have a certain model of therapy that there's a model of therapy called the medical model and a model of therapy called the contextual model. And one is a little bit better at predicting outcomes than the other. And these are competing scientific paradigms that someone there's a great book on it called The Great Psychotherapy Debate, where he outlines these two competing scientific paradigms as though they're one of Hermé Lakatos' research programs, which are this all has to do with philosophy of science. But yeah, it's not that like postmodern therapies aren't helpful. It's not that they're not useful to people, but a lot of our psychological well-being does have to do with sort of our cognitions, our framing of problems, the way we think about the world. But yeah, we can take that, like that fact about the world, that like, yes, you can teach someone to look at the world in a different way that's more positive, and they will change their behavior. Did they really just shape their reality? Or do we know something about how changing cognitions and belief also affects motivation? Like these are sort of sciences in their infancy. Like we don't really understand the underlying neurology behind thoughts. We're really just talking.
Sorry, I take issue with the concept of not trying to direct a patient towards a solution. I don't think that's possible because you're choosing your questions based on...
Solution-focused therapists are a little directive. Therapists lie to each other and ourselves all the time. We claim that we don't impose our values on our clients, even though every time we question something, we're saying whether or not it's valuable.
Yeah.
We say that we don't give advice, even though every time, we tell the client to do something, we're giving them advice. Or every time we talk about them about thinking about it a different way, we're implicitly giving them advice. Therapists, we lie to ourselves. We pretend like we don't tell them what's good, what's bad, what they ought to do.
I actually see the value.
Jordan Peterson explicitly stating like he doesn't believe in the Freudian manner of like where the client's like laying down and not facing their therapist, because he actually says, I want my patient to see my reactions, and so they know exactly like this is what a normal, healthy, or smart person thinks of your thought processes and actions.
Yeah, I actually see the value.
Very forward about that, which is interesting because it doesn't seem to be normal than the way you just described it in the world of therapy.
I see the value of therapy as a more objective person's ability to say things that your people close to you absolutely would say, but you wouldn't accept. So, like, I have an example. My sister, I kept telling her she needed to go to therapy, and she said something about our dad, and in my head I was like, every conclusion you've drawn about an action that our father taken is absurd, and you're wrong about it. And I was like, this is why you have to go to therapy, because what I want to do is ask, why did that make you feel that way? But you're going to say, well, you know, Dad, and you know this. But if somebody else asks it to you, you're actually going to think about what it is. It's like a face of society in a way that you don't have a connection to. So I don't know. I'm going off topic. I just don't believe.
A lot of
I don't believe in the concept
here that'll take its way out of field.
I don't believe in the concept of.
For Sam, though, I have a question for Sam. I think that's important and relevant to the book, even. So, I haven't read the book. I have read your critique of it, and I'm somewhat familiar with Lindsay and Pluckrose and the stuff that initially propelled them to fame/infamy, which was those hoax papers they published to kind of expose how a lot of what they would call postmodernist academic work is completely anti-academic and pseudoscientific. And I question the ethics of that. I guess you could say I'm similar in Sam Harris's boat on lying about things like that. But they did kind of unearth something, and I think the potential flaws of the book notwithstanding, there's something that they noticed that motivated them to do this going on with the postmodern left. And I guess my question to you, Sam, is what do you think that book failed to address properly? That thing that they did, like that, in a way that could give us good solutions or pathways for addressing it.
What their hoax did? What are you asking about, the hoax?
Not about the hoax, about the book. So like
about the book.
Yeah, the hoax is just an example of them reacting to something going on in the postmodern left, particularly as it affects academia. And this is clearly, it's consistent with that train of thought that motivated them to do the hoax. And so I was wondering what you thought the shortcomings of the book were in addressing that, as far as not just merely describing it, but also like proposing solutions to it. Because if they're making errors, then they might not actually give us solutions to the problems, however big or small, that come with the postmodern left.
Well, yeah, so that's going to be the subject of discussion when we get to chapter 10, because they have a whole chapter specifically devoted to trying to give solutions. But like you say, whether they describe the problem accurately is going to influence whether the prescriptions as solutions they give are helpful. So yeah, so let's try to bring it back to the book. And get into the meat of the.
Yeah, I'm desperate to get to page 34 at least, because I do have, like, there they start talking about, like, so they're really going into what do they mean by the postmodern knowledge principle, and they go into Foucault on page 34, and like a little below halfway through the page, they're talking about their interpretation of Foucault, and they say all knowledge is constructed. What is interesting is theorizing about why knowledge got constructed this way. And this is their claim of what Foucault says. And what I thought was missing there is they really could cite other authors who also interpret Foucault this way. And this is one of those areas where I'm like, okay, like I actually agree with you there, Sam, is that like they could cite people and they're not. Like they could show that this is a way that other people consider a valid interpretation of Foucault, and they're just not showing it. Same thing a little bit, I think, similarly below.
Can I bring us a little higher first, and then we get to it? Because there are a few things on page 33 that I thought were worth discussing. So page 33, they're talking about knowledge, and then they say that postmodernism rests on a broad rejection of the correspondence theory of truth, which is a really strange thing to say, because the correspondence theory of truth is just the claim that to say something is true means to say that it corresponds with reality in a certain way.
Because that the words you're using to describe something correspond with a fact about the world. Like correspondence theory is kind of, I don't know, it's awkward, but it has to do with the relationship between our language and facts about the world, which like I don't know.
Well, not necessarily our language, but like the kind of like, but in a more abstract sense, like the propositions that our language expresses. So like what it is for a claim to be true, not necessarily like, I mean, yeah, so you're right to point out that it involves a philosophy of language, but it's more of like a metaphysical theory about like truth, rather than like a theory about language.
I mean, but then what is corresponding then? If there's just the thing in itself that's true, what corresponds to it? The language, the statement.
Well, like the statement that expresses, it's really like the proposition, but this is like
which is placed in language, always in language, right?
But a proposition is not a linguistic entity.
You're talking about it's a cognition. It's a thing that we can conceive of, like a blueness.
Kind of, yeah. Anyways, this is not worth
I get why you're distinguishing
a
proposition from language, but I just think like it's a stupid distinction I'm not interested in, because we're really in the end talking about, does language correspond to facts about the world?
But okay.
And I think postmodernists are quite radically skeptical about that.
Postmodernists typically are, but I don't think that it's like crucial to like you could think that the correspondence theory of truth is true, and yet we just always get it wrong. Like you can think that the correspondence theory gives you what would be true if there were any truths, but that we just like systematically you could have like an error theory.
That just sounds like postmodernism with extra steps. Sorry.
Okay. So then they talk about Foucault, and they say that he explored these ideas at length throughout these works. They list 4 books, and they say, for Foucault, a statement reveals not just information, but also the rules and conditions of a discourse. These then determine the construction of truth claims and knowledge. Dominant discourses are extremely powerful because they determine what can be considered true. Thus, socio-political power is the ultimate determiner of what is true. And again, talking about truth rather than knowledge, because that makes it sound like you actually think that like it's another instance of this truth is an objective idea that, again, like nobody believes because you can't claim that consistently. Like you can't, I mean, I guess some people really do think they believe it and haven't realized that it's self-defeating, but none of these thinkers said this. Then we're on to page 34. They say in the order of things, Foucault argues against objective notions of truth and suggests we think instead of in terms of regimes of truth. And I was able to find the exact translation that they cite of the order of things. They don't give a page number for this claim that he suggests we think in terms of regimes of truth. And it seems that Foucault did develop this idea of regimes of truth, but not until later work, because I searched regimes of truth or just regime in general, and that was nowhere in the book, in the order of things.
Yeah. I'm still on the last page where you talked about sociopolitical power as the ultimate determiner of what is true in Foucault's analysis, and which I agree, if I'm holding them to the standards of a paper in academic philosophy, that's not what Foucault says. Because he's like, oh, it's not literally true because sociopolitically we decided it was true. But it sounds like they're referring to like that sociopolitical power is the ultimate determiner of what is considered to be true in Foucault's analysis.
Which is a huge distinction, because I think that is obviously much more plausible.
Wittgensteinian language games. Like
it's obviously much more plausible to say that sociopolitical
I understood
power
what they meant.
Is a determiner.
How come you didn't understand what they meant, Sam? This seems to be a big problem. You commonly don't understand what they mean.
Then why don't they say what they mean? Because there's a huge distinction between objective truth and objective knowledge.
Is your whole complaint about Lindsay and Pluckrose being inarticulate or them being wrong?
They're not. I don't know. I don't know what which one the problem is. But like there's just obviously a distinction between claiming that there's no objective truth and claiming that knowledge is determined by socio-political power.
Yeah.
What counts as knowledge?
Yeah. I mean, yes. I think that distinction makes sense from an academic philosophical approach, and I understand it's a distinction with a difference. But I guess I'm just like giving them the benefit of the doubt there. Maybe I'm being the asshole.
I don't know. I just think, I think it goes on to play a crucial role, because in the argument that they end up making, which is like, they don't believe in objective truth. And it's like that's the one that they emphasize as like an indicator of the craziness of the postmodern left. Whereas the other one is much more plausible.
I don't believe in objective truth.
Dude, fuck you, internalists.
Well, I don't believe in access to objective truth. I believe it exists, but I don't believe we have access to it. But I don't
right, that's the distinction I'm making.
Yeah.
That's the distinction I'm making. Okay.
Donald Hoffman, desktop theory.
Yeah, exactly.
So you think it might be false that there's something that it's like to be me right now?
There's something that it's like to be me.
Make that statement for yourself. You think it could be false that there's something that it's like to be me right now?
It could be false because I don't necessarily know what it means to be me means. I have an idea of what it means to be me.
Yeah, there is something that it's like. There is something. Like, there's something happening. Yeah, I may just be Parmenides saying the one over and over and over again, but there is something that it's like to be me right now. There may not be the self, but there's something that it's like to be. There's something that it's like to be. Let's just do that. There's something that it's like to be right now. Is it possible that that's false?
I don't think it is.
I'm just giving you access to objective truth.
Is the difference the level of truth? Like what you're saying, Jimmy, is that he's not at the fundamental level of reality and therefore his claim can't be validated?
You cannot be at the fundamental level of reality, and there can still be something that it's like to be right now.
can be,
Like,
but I mean,
I'm a brain in a vat, and there's something that it's like to be a brain in a vat right now. I may not know that I'm a brain in a vat, but there's something that it's like. Like, come on, there's objective truths. You can have access to them. There you go. There's one of them.
So
I use the. I mean, I'm a William James fan, so he would say that that's just a thing as it is. It's not a truth.
Okay.
For William James, truth is an adjective.
If you say something is a thing as it is, you're saying it's true that something is a thing as it is.
No, like an example would be that a triangle has 3 sides, right? That's just the thing as it is.
What you just said is equivalent to saying it's true that a triangle has.
No, I mean I don't agree with that. I get.
No, so James has this like abstract, like religious, metaphysical idea of what truth means. Then.
Yes, right? He does.
So then we have different ideas about truth.
Yes.
So we're arguing past each other. Let's move on.
I've got some other places I feel like they don't cite themselves, and they really ought to.
Right.
I'm happy to get into those.
The bottom of 34. The bottom of 34 is scientific reasoning is construed as a meta-narrative, a sweeping explanation. Okay, where? In whose work? Examples, please.
You don't think that's in the order of things when Foucault is talking about episteme and referring to that as a reference to science in Western culture?
I haven't read that in depth. I've like read about it a little bit, but I don't think Foucault is really talking about
I think they
reasoning. He's talking about particular sciences more so. And if he is talking about that in that book, then they should tell us that, and they should cite it.
I mean, there is literally above, they talk about in the order of things, and I assume that that's what they're talking about for the rest of this page.
We talk about regimes of truth. Well, also, I mean, as I said, he doesn't talk about regimes of truth there.
Are you sure you had the same translation as them?
Yeah.
Okay.
At least the one that they give in the bibliography and in the endnote.
And you just like Control F regime? Nothing?
Yeah. And I downloaded like a Foucault companion where people are talking about regimes of truth in another later work.
So it's something that's discussed when people discuss Foucault, but it's not something Foucault himself ever said?
No, I think it's something Foucault used the term, just not in that work.
Oh, okay.
And it was in a later work. Yeah.
Okay.
Then so scientific,
But this keeps on coming up that Foucault never. You keep on claiming that Foucault never like questioned, was very skeptical of science, and you keep on saying the book claims that Foucault did this, and I think I'm obviously I'm more on the book side here, and it's like I think this is something like we can maybe like research like next week and like see if we can find like a good quote, because I'm pretty sure they're right, but it seems like you're pretty sure they're wrong. And
I have a high degree of confidence that Foucault is skeptical of scientific reasoning as a project, like as in like this is a cultural project that we ought to regard as a producer of true knowledge. That Foucault is in general skeptical of people. He thinks people ought not hold that belief, like they not ought have that bias that scientific knowledge is more likely to be true than other kinds of knowledge. I think that would be a fair thing to get from Foucault. And I think that's what Lindsay and Pluckrose are saying.
I'd love to see. I mean, just first of all, any evidence that Foucault is talking about the sciences beyond the human sciences, as he himself stressed many, many times, he was only talking about. And I would even love to see the evidence that he was sort of trying to prescribe people to be like distrusting of the sciences or something like that. I think he was encouraging people to be probably more skeptical than most people tended to be. I think that there is honestly a pervasive problem of being having too much faith in science that we've had for a long time. I don't know what the exact right amount of faith in science is, but
wavering absolute.
I mean, pretty much all of his work seemed to be descriptive with any prescriptive sort of being implicit in the genealogy that he's giving that is likely to undermine people's faith in whatever it is that he's explaining the history of.
Can I ask a question? It's a little further on. It's on page 35, and it's about Derrida. And I was trying to find this interlinkage they're talking about, and I couldn't really understand exactly what they're referring to between politics and science.
You're talking about Lyotard.
I thought it was Derrida.
Or Derrida at the bottom.
Yes.
Yeah. It says
Derrida's not really talking.
No, strict interlinkage between the language of science and that of politics and ethics.
Oh, it was Lyotard. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I downloaded the Lyotard and I read the first 20 or so pages of the postmodern condition. And then it got abstract and I had something else I had to do, but I wanted to see how fairly they were characterizing him, at least at the beginning. When he says a strict interlinkage between the language of science and that and politics of ethics, he's talking basically just about like justification. He's saying like, look, when you say something's morally right or wrong, you're expected to give a justification for that. When you're saying something is like scientifically, like that a certain hypothesis is respectable or a certain theory is useful, you're expected to give a justification for that. That's really like all it is. But above, I wanted to focus on the paragraph describing Lyotard from the bottom of 34 over spilling onto 35. They say, this view, which view? The view that knowledge is provincial and intrinsically political, is widely attributed to the French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard, who critiqued science, the Enlightenment, and Marxism. Each of these projects was, for Lyotard, a prime example of a modernist or Enlightenment meta-narrative. It's just not true. He doesn't call science a meta-narrative. He calls Marxism and the Enlightenment meta-narratives. Sure you do. Do whatever you want. But he doesn't call
Uh-oh. Sam, you're breaking up.
He mourned the demise of small local languages passed on in narrative form and viewed the loss of meaning-making intrinsic to scientific detachment as a loss of valuable narratives. And then they say that his famous characterization of postmodernism has been extremely influential. And then they give a citation, endnote 30. For that whole paragraph of claims, they just cite the book, no page numbers. And so much of what they say in it, I just couldn't find evidence of. The evidence that he's like mourning the demise of small local knowledges passed on in narrative form, I didn't see any evidence of that. It seems to me like, and I'll reveal my interpretation of how the book was written, is that they read the chapters, the stuff that makes up chapters 3 through 8, the post-colonial theory, the critical race theory, the feminist theory, and the modern day social justice scholarship and thought. And they read, after that, they went back to the OG postmodernists and they sort of read into these thinkers things that just weren't there. And this seems to me like an example of when they're talking about the small local knowledges that they say Lyotard is mourning the demise of, that this is going to be the foundation of certain claims made sometimes in post-colonial theory about like the relativism of knowledge, and that like we need to like respect indigenous knowledges, and that like some people even claiming that we should like replace science and empirical investigation with like indigenous ancient wisdom, that sort of thing. I couldn't find any evidence of that claim and several other claims, including science as a meta-narrative, in Lyotard. I mean, I think it's pretty insane to make all those claims and then to just cite the book without any page numbers.
It's a fair criticism.
I mean, it does sort of relate to the earlier point we're making, right? This is really not like an academic work, either in sort of.
Right,
I think it does make academic claims, but it doesn't really stand up in some way.
Yeah,
But
I
the
think
standard I'm
there
holding
is
them
something
to
they
is
can
not
do,
even
which
like an
is-
academic standard. It's just like a basic standard of providing evidence for claims.
I mean, I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know, but I wrote this down that I feel like this book is attempting to talk about what postmodernism does, not what it is, which is why I hate this chapter, because I mean, I didn't like it reading it because I
actually like this chapter.
Well, the problem is this conversation. Every time we talk about what postmodernism is, it's just a pointless conversation. I've never had a good conversation about what postmodernism is. It's never, because it evades definition and it's impossible to peg it down.
But you need to know what postmodernism, at least what you mean by the term postmodernism, in order to have the discussion about what it does.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Sam, in that they're saying that they're defining just the Glom philosophy as having to do with, for some reason, the postmodern knowledge principle and postmodern political principle are not part of the 4 major themes. I think they could have just made it the 6 major themes of postmodernism, but for some reason they didn't. But yeah, I think they somewhat. I give them that they somewhat, like, I give them like a B plus, maybe like a B minus on substantiating that postmodernism has these themes in it and that these thinkers have these themes. But yeah, like it's certainly not up to like publishing standards to say that these thinkers definitely have these themes. And I think one of the things that they really could have done is not just cite these thinkers directly, where they end up citing a whole book claiming that it has this view in it if you interpret it, but they could have cited other people who interpret it this way, or they could have cited other people who review these books and say that this is the case. And I thought that was the case again, like they say on page 36, these thinkers argues that the powerful have organized society to benefit them and perpetuate their power. Like you can cite a summary that says that that's what these thinkers are arguing. And then they go on and say that they believe the systems are patriarchal, white supremacist, heteronormative, therefore necessarily grant unfair access. And I was like, wait a second, they like jumped to that. And that was a big jump.
Yeah.
Like where it was like suddenly
Huge
we were
jump.
at Foucault's knowledge power, and then there's like the modern ways where people think power are organized along white supremacy and patriarchy, and I don't know, that came out of nowhere.
And Foucault was very against these sort of identity politics ways of seeing the world. Like,
how could Foucault know?
Huh?
Ours is being stupid. How could Foucault know?
I can't hear you. You're very quiet.
I have nothing to add. Go on. Sorry.
Foucault couldn't actually know. He's a white guy. He can't know that society's patriarchal. He benefits from those systems of oppression.
I mean, it seems like you really think they did a bad job summarizing these people, and like they really don't know what they're talking about, and they're really like a bad like.
I think they didn't read the fucking books that they cite.
With that.
I disagree. I think they read the books, and I think they provide like part of this is that I can't always substantiate everything they claim about it, but in general, the people who I've heard discuss Foucault, the Foucault that I have experience with, and the ways that I've seen postmodernism applied seems to suggest that these themes are present, that they seem to originate with some of these thinkers, and that this is a useful description of what comes out of them. And even like on 38, they've got a quote from Foucault. My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous. It's not exactly the same as bad. If everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. So my position leads not to apathy, but to hyper and pessimistic activism. I think the ethico-political choice we have to make every day is to determine which is the main danger. And to assume that that doesn't say anything about science is just saying, well, Foucault wasn't actually that broad. He didn't say we should attack science. It's like, but obviously he's talking about episteme. He's saying it's dangerous. You ought to be critical of it.
But
you ought to
but
say,
everything is dangerous. Even saying that science should be done away with, or that science is a problem, that's dangerous too.
Yeah. So just this radical skepticism that seems to be part of the blurring of boundaries between true and false, that seems to be there in that. It seems to have to do with the power of language to construct that which people normally consider true and false. The loss of the individual is really just subject to society, but really there's no universal, so there's no human universal or truth that we can appeal to determine whether it's good or bad, because Foucault's not even saying it's bad. He's just saying it's dangerous. We can be subject to this. It can really subsume us. We can all fall prey to these lies. It's like, I don't know. I think it's a reasonable interpretation to say that that's critical of science. I think it's reasonable to interpret that to say that that contains the four themes.
You see, so
this is like the example I was thinking of.
I have a issue.
I was like thinking about this was like with hydrochloroquine. Like you like turn on the great one, Mark Levine on Fox News, and he has an expert from Yale telling him that hydrochloroquine, is great for people with COVID-19. It saves them. People over 65 should always use hydrochloroquine. It's one of the best drugs out there. And you have people on, MSNBC, experts from, just as prestigious of university say the exact opposite, that it's, doesn't work at all. So I kind of reminds me what Foucault's getting at is science has it asks a lot of us, and it seems like there's a lot of room for interpretation within science to come to radically different conclusions. And it's not like science can't, it's not I think if you had 5 really smart scientists and you had them read these studies, they could figure out if it worked or not. But for some reason, that's not happening. So, that was my point.
Would it be fair to say
a vindication of Foucault?
Would it be fair to say it's similar to Karl Marx and modern interpretations of communism and maybe the radical left, where it's Karl Marx wrote a book, that had certain points that were validly made, but then it got picked up by groups that wanted to implement that theory, and it turned into something much different. And maybe that's kind of what James Lindsay and Pluckrose are doing, is taking that work that was created by Foucault and others and kind of bastardizing it into a incorrect interpretation.
That's a great.
That's how they discuss the book. They say we know that Foucault would have hated all of the modern day D'Angelo types that he inspired, and to some extent they do make it clear throughout the book that these are bastardizations of Foucault, but they should first get the Foucault right, and I'm not convinced that they do based on the way that they describe him in this chapter.
I disagree. I feel there are times where I pointed out where they really could cite that other people interpret Foucault this way, but I think a charitable read would say they're giving a plausible read of Foucault, and in fact a way that many people have read those influenced by Foucault down the line. We're kind of getting okay, well, is it real Marxism? Well, no, Marx said, I'm not a Marxist by the end of his life, because Marx didn't agree with Marxism. That's why I love that allegory, is because, one, you ask Marx, are you a Marxist? And he says, no. And then you ask Marxists what they think of all the attempts at communism, and they say, well, that wasn't real Marxism. And
exactly.
This seems to be the same thing that we're running into with postmodernism. And I think it's a totally charitable take for them to have these descriptions of postmodernism. I think these are reasonable interpretations of some of these authors, and they establish a number of their points.
Where are
and
the
some
citations?
are a little soft. You're only hitting the citations that you don't like. Half of them are citations that you either works you haven't read, like The Order of Things, or on places where you actually don't object to them. Like when they cite Foucault, Baudrillard, and Lyotard a number of times that you didn't object to, because some of them are unobjectionable.
How many times do they cite them with page numbers versus how many times do they just cite?
Dude,
it's ridiculous.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. They're not up to academic standards of citing the line. But like, this is also like an eel wrestling contest, man. Like trying to nail down what is postmodernism, not an easy task. Like they hold the eel for a long time, and I'm actually quite satisfied with their ability to hold eels.
That's exactly why I hate this chapter, because that eel wrestling metaphor is perfect. That's what it feels like to try to talk about what postmodernism is. I'm curious, Sam, did you agree with the idea of criticizing what is most dangerous? That things that it's not necessarily bad, but all things are dangerous. Is that accurate?
Is it true that everything is dangerous?
No. Is it true of the way that postmodernists is it true of
That's a direct quote of Foucault.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one.
So
of the
what if postmodernism is the most dangerous thing?
Yeah, they'd be fine with that. They'd be fine with that. Postmodernists would not object to that. That's fine.
That's absurd to me. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, welcome to postmodernism.
But and like, also like, how are we determining what's more dangerous than anything else? How do we know?
You don't.
So then, how can we criticize it? I mean, that's what I mean by like, I see this as the head of the snake that's consuming itself but never growing.
No.
It's just
I think you're missing that we can identify those things which are most dangerous, and the things that are most dangerous are those things that exert the most power. And those things that exert the most power are those things that are commonly expressed by people without them really being able to justify why they believe it, or their justification really being an appeal to a socially constructed way of viewing the world. So those are always the dangerous things. Those are the things that Foucault highlights. It happens to lead him to some bad conclusions, even though we can also take good conclusions from it.
You sound like James Lindsay. I'm guessing you're an anti-theist as well.
Yes. Yeah. You caught me. You caught me. You pinned me as an atheist. So their citation.
No. And I'm accusing you of being an anti-theist, which is different.
Yeah, no, I know, and
Wait,
I'm a crotchety atheist, so I'm also an anti-theist. On page 33, they do say the postmodern approach might be acknowledged that objective reality exists, but it focuses on the barrier to knowing that reality by examining cultural biases and assumptions and theorizing about how they work. And it's sort of like, okay, cool, like that's one of the things Chomsky describes as like trivially true about postmodernism. And then in the back, they end up talking about how this is like this. One way to look at this was that it could lead us to very valid critiques of science that are quite deserved. Like clearly psychology deserves the replication crisis. Like, but to assume that like psychologists are just still caught up in their episteme and they all think psychology is right and they're not paying to the attention replication crisis at all is missing what's actually going on in the culture of psychology, where people are freaking out about the right amount about the replication crisis.
And that doesn't contradict Foucault at all. He wouldn't have to say that all psychologists just dogmatically accept psychology.
Yes, and that's what's going on. Foucault is being misused in the modern day because people are taking that conclusion from him and rejecting psychology entirely, and I know people who do that.
And that's the problem and so this is the thing that people pushed back on my review for, was that they said, look, you're not addressing the real problem. The real problem is the activism, right? They made that like that's the real purpose of their book, is to address like the activism. Well, then what are the 6-7 chapters that don't focus on activism, that focus on like theory from the academy? What are they there for? What are they doing? They should have written a different book if they don't want to focus on scholarship.
I wish we had this conversation closer to the beginning, because now no one at all is listening, but it's fine. I think this is one of the areas where we really like run into sort of the core of why we have a disagreement. And I think it's that I'm interested in how the academic movement that we call postmodernism has a number of plausible readings. And for people who are academic postmodernists, they have rather exacting standards of what postmodernism does and doesn't say. For the many people who get exposed to this philosophy, they have actually plausible readings of the philosophy that lead them to certain conclusions that are like, you can get that conclusion from Foucault, a radical skepticism of all science and a belief that, like, you know, my conspiracy theories about reality are just as likely to be true. And like, I think that's a plausible reading that people end up getting when they take these courses and they walk away from these texts with sort of a radical take on the knowability of truth and how much their lived experience really reflects truth. Like, and how much they ought not privilege the things that seem like socially dominant forms of knowledge, and how much they ought to privilege their own, like, what feels like their own interpretation of, like, what are the real systems of power at play. I think that's a totally plausible reading of Foucault that many people walk away from these classes from, and leads to some of the social justice activism that is unhinged from empirical data. And I think they make a fine case for that.
If it's such a plausible reading, then they should show us what texts give us that reading. They should tell us what Foucault says that gives us that reading.
Okay, they literally give you like a solid quote on page 38 that has perfectly good reading for that. Like, and you're
Foucault
like, oh,
just
that
says everything is dangerous. So,
yes,
so including walking away from this class thinking X, Y, and Z about Foucault is dangerous. Doesn't say it's any more or less dangerous than anything else.
Yeah, I suppose. You know, I don't know. I just, yeah.
And also, I think it's worth taking the context of that quote. I can't remember. Man, it'll take me too long. But I went and found the context, and he's talking about like different ways of doing. He's asked a question by an interviewer about like, so are you saying that like in your history of sexuality, you know how the Greeks didn't have a notion of homosexuality? Are you suggesting we like go in that direction? He's like, no, absolutely not. Like, yeah. I'm not suggesting we replace the modern conception of sexuality with the ancient Greek one. I'm just trying to point out the problems. Like, I'm just trying to point out I'm just trying to problematize. I'm not trying to give any solutions whatsoever. I'm just.
What do you think about the final paragraph on page 37? Because I think that's a coherent thought about how it becomes something else. Like logically how it leads to that. It's not a cited paragraph. It's clearly what they're drawing this conclusion. But I think,
yeah, I was gonna say 36 and 37, just two huge, like, crucial pages for their interpretation of postmodernism with 0 citations. And on 36, they start with this becomes relevant to 37. They say at the top of 36 that power decides not only what is factually correct, but also what is morally good. Where did you get this from? None of the postmodernists talk about, none of them have like an ethical theory or like that tell us, none of them tell us that it's good to deconstruct power. This is like entirely their take on it. And Foucault himself was very explicit about power not being a bad thing.
Are you saying none of the postmodernists, as in none of the postmodern mainstay thinkers, or are you talking about the modern masses adopting the philosophy?
I'm talking about the postmodernists that they're talking about, that they purport to be talking about in this chapter, which is the Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and Baudrillard.
Yeah.
So they start talking about. They say that we should. They see the world very much like a conspiracy theory, except that there are no conspirators. They contrast it with Marxism. Then they say that there are these like patriarchy and white supremacy things going on. Racial and sexual minorities come in on 37, and then by the bottom of 37, is that the paragraph you were talking about, Jimmy?
Yeah. Yes.
So it says, because they focused on self-perpetuating systems of power, few of the original postmodern theorists advocated any specific political actions. This is true. Indeed, meaningful change was largely regarded as impossible under the original postmodernism due to the inherent meaninglessness of everything and the culturally relative nature of morality. What?
So you take issue with that part?
Meaningful change was largely regarded as impossible under the original postmodernism due to the inherent meaninglessness of everything and the culturally relative nature of morality. Just thinking that morality is culturally relative doesn't mean that there can be no meaningful change. And where did they get the idea about the inherent meaninglessness of everything? That's like a Zen Buddhist idea.
Well, I mean,
this results in, but then how does this does it follow?
Well, because I don't understand
this results
how
in an ethical imperative.
But I don't understand how you
deconstruct.
can result in anything but meaninglessness if meta narratives are the problem. I mean, where does meaning come from if not a meta narrative?
From narratives.
Yeah, I still, we've had this discussion. I just don't understand. I can't see how you can have a narrative that doesn't rest on top of a meta narrative. If you're going to have a should. If you're going to have
saying a subjective, narratives are very subjective. They're very like first person. They're sort of like this like existential, like I'm defining the meaning for myself. Like I have a story about this. It connects to other things that are important to me. But that what's important to me is not part of a meta narrative, which would be greater than an individual.
Who's saying that?
But
I thought that's what you were saying.
But Sam. where would what means something to you come from, except some sort of meta narrative you've taken for yourself? I mean, I don't understand where meaning can come from without a meta narrative.
The self is a meta narrative, bro. Just there's no self. Get over it.
Can we talk about the citations again, though? Because I brought this up earlier. Like, if you read like Bertrand Russell, like he's an expert in philosophy, and he's like giving his take on Hegel, right? He doesn't like, cite the pages of Hegel where he got his opinion from Hegel. You're as a reader, you're giving Russell credit that he's an expert, and he obviously knows more about it than you, and he's telling you what Hegel how he interprets Hegel. So I think
people also fight over whether his history of Western philosophy is like biased or not.
Is worth anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure. People think he hated Nietzsche, and a lot of people like Nietzsche. So like, I mean, for sure, like
Nietzsche?
Nietzsche, bro.
Oh, Nietzsche.
How do you? Oh,
Gotcha.
Nietzsche. Sorry.
Sorry. No one can agree on this. There's a few extra consonants. Niche. I kind of like that.
But I feel like this. They need to cite pages is like a little like you have to give them like some leeway, and like they're the experts. They're telling us like what the hell's going on.
But they're not experts. They're so clearly not experts.
So you take.
No, I think that's also an appeal to authority that you don't have to give anyone that authority. Yeah.
They're so clearly not experts. Like there's a difference between giving Bertrand Russell like one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, a degree of expertise when he's writing his history of Western philosophy that he spent his entire life studying, versus Lindsay and Pluckrose, who did the Grievance Studies affair and then read some Foucault.
They're very highly published philosophers. Have you been published in Hypatia?
I have not.
But the real part of that paragraph that I was curious about is the conclusion. This results in an ethical imperative to deconstruct. I completely agree with that, and my experience in reality is that is what happens. Is
right? But they just said everything's meaningless and that everything's culturally relative. Where does the ethical imperative to deconstruct come from?
It's a good question.
To find meaning.
Yeah, I mean,
also, people in the YouTube chat are talking about LOLing at Russell not reading Hegel. Like, you fucking read Hegel. Explain Hegel to me. Don't dumb it down. Make Hegel make sense. Don't dumb it down.
Don't fucking read Hegel. It's a waste of time.
Like, no, idealists are full of shit. Like, don't listen to these people. There's a reason why no one's an idealist anymore.
Then they say, yeah, where the fuck did they get the point about an ethical imperative to deconstruct? Resist
I
all
feel
ways
like
of
you're right
thinking
in
that support oppressive.
There's an odd contradiction in that paragraph. But yeah, it's tough because I think they're also referring to, and in one place they talk about, they do mention specifically the term, the implication of the text, because there's one thing of like let's take a a different literary theory where yes, there are the words on the page, but then what is being implied by these words being on the page? It's being implied that you ought to think this way, that you ought to view it this way, you ought to deconstruct as I am deconstructing. So while Foucault may say there is indeed no good or bad, indeed he's advocating for this constant deconstruction of systems of power and seems to be suggesting to the reader by implication that you might want to do this as well. I'm the one telling you what is really worth paying attention to. Like, I think it is implied in his work that we ought to be deconstructing systems of power in society, even though he doesn't actually have that prescriptive statement. You should be deconstructing systems of power bad. Like, no, he doesn't get that clear. But clearly we can walk away from Foucault feeling, without ever being able to quote him saying that deconstruction good, systems of power bad. Like, and yet I think there's a perfectly plausible reading of Foucault. Does this, like, am I taking crazy pills here?
No.
Like, is that not implied?
No, I totally understand where you're coming from, but I think
to me like you're arguing like let's say you're talking about something unrelated like Christianity, and you're talking about Trinitarian theory within Christianity. You're like, well, the Bible wasn't really specifically talking about Trinitarianism. How can you say this is really Christian? And it's like a plausible charitable reading of why someone might criticize Trinitarian Christianity, and then using biblical source material isn't crazy, even if the Bible on its face wasn't strictly Trinitarian, correct? So I feel like you look at a lot of the skepticism of epistemology itself that seems to be nestled within Foucault's views, and I think for Eric to look at it and say, well, that's a charitable reading of his thing, an application of his thoughts, isn't crazy, and it's understandable, and ultimately there's going to be one reading of it that is the one that gets picked up, and that's the one that was.
I'm kind of jumping ahead, but you think it would have been like a better like book if they just picked like 4 or 5 like philosopher academics to go over instead of like going over so many different academics. Is that like I'm this is kind of like jumping to the next chapter where they do this a lot. They like this next chapter they like cover like 7-8 different people, and I feel like we're covering a lot of ground, you know.
Well, that's just wait till the rest of the book. I mean, the book is supposed to go into all these different areas that it interprets, all these different sort of sub-disciplines, or really new disciplines that emanated out of these postmodern thinkers. And then that sort of, the idea is that these different new disciplines sort of consolidated into what is now social justice scholarship, and that this is the reified postmodernism.
But I mean, your critique seems pretty valid in that the way that they wrote the book really opens the door for them to say, well, you have this quote, but they also somewhere else they said this, and it really opens the door for them to like cherry pick like according to you, they didn't even do that. They didn't even weren't even that good at cherry picking, bad quotes from Foucault. And I feel like it would be better if they just said, all right, bell hooks, we're calling for you.
Yeah, right.
Here's the chapter.
Yeah, exactly.
Hooks.
Because
let's go after her.
When they responded to my criticism, one of the things James Lindsay said was like, this guy, this fucking nerd thinks like we weren't nice enough to Foucault. And like, I had one fucking line about it in the review. It was not at all like the point of my review, but a lot of the things that they discuss, or if you go to their Twitters and you like look at what they're tweeting about in response to any of the critiques, they're like, I don't give a fuck what Foucault actually meant, right? Because the real point is like what these people interpreting his work later on, what they meant and what they're saying. And if that's the real point of the book, then I don't see what the point of even giving this first chapter is. Like why don't they just say that, look, we think that these postmodern knowledge principle and these four themes have existed in applied postmodernism and reified postmodernism, and whether they can be actually found in the original postmodernists is irrelevant to us, because that
I
seems
agree
to
with
be
you.
what they actually think.
I agree with you. That's why I don't like this chapter. I really don't like this chapter because the wrestling with the Neil thing is the perfect metaphor. It's pointless. It doesn't do anything for their argument. I mean, I didn't read the whole book, but from what I know about what their goals are with this book, I don't know why this chapter is in the book.
I think they know that providing a genealogy for ideas has a way of making those ideas seem less mystical to people, seem less like if you can point to the humans that they came from, it makes them feel less like the ideas have a little less power. I think that's kind of what they're doing with this, and I actually agree with that take, Sam, that like, you know, they could say that we think these ideas are a problem, they pop up in these places, we think they were influenced by these thinkers, even though not exactly being in their work. There are some people who seem to interpret their work this way or have been influenced by their work and now hold these beliefs. I think that would be fair. I'm gonna sign off though and actually spend time with my wife and eat dinner. But yeah,
sensible.
Good chat. Good 3-hour chat, guys. Thanks for letting me talk mad shit, Sam.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, reasonable pushback for sure. I wish James Lindsay had any idea how to do it.
I mean, you know, he can use some lessons on how to argue with people, because he gets pretty reactionary and butthurt. But you know, maybe one day. Okay, later, guys.
Take care. So then the rest. So what's the rest of the chapter? They have the four principles. I'm sorry, the four themes. And who do they cite? Anyone? Why should I think that these people are cultural relativists? Do they give a citation in the cultural relativism section? Nope. Their discussion, when they talk about the power of language, they talk about Derrida, and they attribute to him something that comes from Saussure, which is structuralism, and Derrida is a post-structuralist.
When I read this chapter, I thought this is for people who know nothing. Like somebody read the book without this chapter and they were like, nobody knows what this is, and then they added it. That's how I feel about.
So they filled it in. Exactly. They added it, right? So they had to look for places where they could reasonably say, oh, this idea came from this place, and they just pointed to books and like found a few quotes that they gave some page numbers for.
It's so funny. Like I push back on you when we discuss things, but like in my mind, I feel stuck because I am nowhere near the objectivist that Eric is. Nowhere. I don't. But I do think that postmodernism has taken a turn that's gone absolutely insane, and you can track it to that hypercriticalism, hyper-skepticism. So I feel stuck in the middle. That's why I like William James. But it's really hard to. It's really hard. It's so polarized, just like everything else, that anything that doesn't take a side feels like a cop-out.
It seems to me that, like, you know, everyone can talk about how this isn't supposed to be an academic book, like, so they don't need to come up to the same citations and stuff. My point is, like, I hadn't read any of these thinkers before I read this book, and they just didn't give me reasons to think that their analysis was correct. They just didn't.
See, I think James Lindsay, I don't know much about Helen Pluckrose, but I know James Lindsay is that the right term, objectivist? He's very
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I'm not like that, so I have a bunch of criticisms
I think you mean objective, but objectivism is Ayn Rand's school of thought.
Well, Ayn Rand thought that she could name her philosophy that, but it gets used in more reasonable ways by other people.
Yeah, just the idea in objective truth, and I have trouble with that for completely other reasons, and I feel like if somebody to bloat my ego, if somebody like me had written this book, it might have been a little better, because Lindsay, I'm not capable of writing a book like this, but the reason I'm saying is because Lindsay comes at it from the polar opposite side, where he's not understanding what it is they are criticizing, or doesn't want to. I feel the same way when I have religious conversations with people who are like that, because it's like, you're not hearing me and you can't hear me, and you're not understanding what I'm trying to do. Whereas I read this book and I'm like all of my notes are, I agree with this, however, like that's how I read this, is I agree with what these postmodernists are saying, however, because
yeah, I had a very similar thought when I'm reading this. Is like, there's just points where it sounds too sure of itself.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I get where you can get that, but I don't think that's the only way to take what they're saying here, or like he's drawing lines right from these original thinkers to like different stages to what we have today, and it's like those lines are too solid, right? It's not a straight shot by any interpretation, and they sort of make that acknowledgement at points, and then at other points it's like, no, it's actually much more solid than that.
See, okay.
I definitely agree with Sam, like, to that extent, that it probably would have been a stronger book in some ways if they'd have just not made it about the original people so much. And Eric was kind of pointing to why they did that, right? It makes the ideas a little bit less scary.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that also weakens some of their points. Like, you can just say, yes, these activists are wrong. Like, this, you could have just said, this is the wrong interpretation of these original ideas, instead of saying the original ideas are flawed.
I'd go further. I'd go further.
Like this chapter, I think it's gonna get worse. I think you guys are going to not like the other chapters like a lot, because they do like the things that you guys are criticizing. Like, this is one of the better chapters I've read so far. The first one about postmodernism.
I really think they could go further and say, this is like, what's happening is a bad take on your philosophy, and it's actually you guys who need to define yourselves. Like, anybody who's considering postmodernism to be a positive thing in the way that, Sam, you are describing it, this is why I bring up the meta conversation about categorization and being willing to accept, like, this is what this is and other things are not it. That is, to me, a huge flaw in postmodernism, is that it can't seem to do that. It can't seem to draw a boundary around itself and say, no, that's not included. I don't know if you disagree with me on that. And then I want to put a chat up because I'm curious what everybody thinks about this.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. So like, that might be true. Sure. I just, again, like, if they're trying to convince, I guess they're probably not trying to convince, but like, if they're claiming that, like, this is what these thinkers think, and this is what, like, these 2 principles and 4 themes are what these postmodernists have in common, they haven't convinced me of that. They haven't given me enough evidence.
I think. If the primary objective of the book is to instruct you about what the original postmodernists thought, it's not very good at that. Like, I think a lot of people would agree with that.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say, Sam?
I was gonna say, like, then yeah, right. if that was the primary purpose, yes. But the primary purpose seems to be that like these 2 principles and 4 themes are at the heart of all of the problematic scholarship that has influenced the current activists that we think are illiberal and that we need to fight back against with liberalism. Like that seems to be like the thesis of the book. And I mean, my critique of chapter 8, as we'll see when we get there, is that most of these thinkers they cite in chapter 8 don't believe in like any of the two principles and the 4 themes. Definitely not the postmodern knowledge theme principle, and definitely not the theme of cultural relativism for most of the chapter 8 thinkers. And yet these are supposed to be the common thread throughout the scholarship in its evolution. And the scholarship, then there's the other problem of claiming that the scholarship is like what has influenced the activism. But yeah,
there's definitely a problem in terms of like it's not coherent. Like all of the people that fit into whichever bubble we're like, or the circle we're drawing around postmodernism, like they're not coherent within themselves, right? Like all those ideas aren't coherent. So if anytime you get into these sort of like, these are the 6 characteristics, and not everybody has those, right? But do you think that that's sort of like, does that mean that the label is wrong? Like we can't label people as postmodern if they don't have.
And to that point, I mean, is it worth saying that? No, you're good. I'm just wondering if we can kind of ignore the shortcomings in terms of how they surmise the thinkers' principles and look more at, is it true that these thinkers influenced the chain of thoughts that led to the teachers in academia teaching these theories in this way? Like, is that a tangible thread that we can show, even if the criticism of the thinkers themselves is not fully correct?
Yeah, that's where I was going.
I would think the what it should be is like, for the book's sake, it would have to be something like, not just a question of whether they were influenced by these thinkers, but the question of whether these principles and themes that they identify are present in the problematic scholarship that we're focusing on now, right?
I want to put a comment on screen because this is a person who's also very critical of Lindsay and Pluckrose, and they were saying this is I don't remember exactly the context, but it's the same sort of attitude that that's James Lindsay had with 2 + 2 = 5. See, that was something I was totally on board with James Lindsay on. Like, I think that's an absurd, like the whole 2 + 2 = 5 thing to me is just a sign of insanity. I mean, if you cannot see why that's an absurd thing, then I don't see how you can defend it.
I mean, I don't either, but people like some of the most respected mathematicians in the world working today came to sort of come into the Twitter discussion and say, like, look, it's a little more nuanced than what Lindsay is saying. Like, obviously, it's not true that, like, ordinarily speaking, 2 + 2 = 5, obviously. But went on and did a huge thread about it, and I'm not particularly interested in abstract math, so I don't care. But I don't think that we should reject it outright.
Okay,
what they're basically like.
No, go ahead.
The gist of it is just being like, look, there are contexts in very high order mathematics where it's useful to sort of work with different axioms, and under some axioms it might be true to say 2 + 2 = 5 or something like that.
Some people are claiming that it's a perfect example of the postmodern knowledge principle, and the same person who said the original comment said it's about the definitions you have set up beforehand. Okay, fine. But 2, like numbers are universal. 2 is 2. 2 is 2. Plus is plus. Equals is equals. There's no, it's a universal language. There's no situation where 2 things and 2 things result in 5 things. Like, I've heard this crazy one where it's 1 and 1 it makes 3 because one person, like a man and a wife, makes a child and then they have 3 people. But like, that's like explicitly trying to misconstrue what is being communicated.
This seems like one of a perfect example of where like people are trying to communicate different things. They're like, you don't mean the same thing. Like we all act like these numbers or like this simple equation has the same message. Like it has the different message to different people. There's no reason to pretend like we're all talking about the same thing when we're obviously not.
I think that's the challenge. Is the goal is often to not talk about the same thing, because if we can present a gotcha, then we can provide then we can take the power in the argument. Then we can win.
Everybody's looking for like a quotable thing that they can stick in their tweet and get somebody with, so that they can get whatever attention they're seeking. But at the end of the day, it's like reasonable people can agree on both things. There might be some like yes, mathematicians might find that this is like not perfectly relevant in whatever obscure rule set they're using for like discrete mathematics, and then another person can come up and say, but like everybody knows this is true. Those are saying different things. We can all agree on that, and we should be able to move past it relatively quickly without it becoming like this is not an intelligent discussion at this point.
I mean, does it come from the Dostoevsky quote? Twice 2 makes 4. No? Because in the end, he says, I admit that twice 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing, but if we are to give everything its due, twice 2 makes 5 is sometimes a very charming thing too. But
yeah, it's like a common example. It's also in 1984.
Yeah.
On like 2 + 2 = 4 being an obvious truth, and 2 + 2 = 5 being like government, like authoritarian. You must think this.
Trying to get you to think something that is to be untrue. And I guess for me, if there's no bottom where we can at least agree in mathematics, like the example of a triangle has 3 sides, right? It's axiomatically true based on the way, not on my way of looking at truth, but in the more common way of looking at truth. It's axiomatically true. It's a truism. So if we can't agree on that, how like we can't build off of anything. And to me, that makes the whole, if that's acceptable within that philosophy, then is the philosophy not just bunk? It won't produce anything. You can't build off of that.
Sure. Yeah, but I don't see how postmodernism leads you to think 2 + 2 = 5.
Well, all these postmodernists in the chat seem to be defending it. Is all like.
Well, I'll add something. Maybe a good example. I'm looking at grad schools for a PhD in social psychology, and one of the grad schools that I'm looking at is Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz's social psychology program is actually rooted in what they call a history of social justice and a social justice form of social psychology. If you actually look at what their lens that they use for all their education, they use feminism and critical theory. Now, I am disgusted by that personally, because I want to go to a university and actually use research and multivariant analyses and whatnot to determine a truth, not use a social justice agenda. Now, I think it could be argued that UC Santa Cruz in that case is actually teaching these, postmodern ideas instead of actually teaching research methods and how to create objective truths. So that might be an example of an institution doing it.
Seems to me like the opposite of postmodernism. It's got a sweeping meta narrative. It's this critical theory that comes from the Marxist Frankfurt School. It doesn't seem very postmodern.
The more conspiratorial part of me, again, this is a conspiracy theory that I can't defend, but it says a bunch of Marxists knew we can't use Marxism anymore, and if we have anything that looks like it's just going to get taken down immediately. So instead, let's just attack the concept of like structure, and then Marxism, like if Marx was right, then the communist utopia will come out of the collapse. I mean, to me, there's at least a connection there.
Well, I mean, isn't that kind of the point? If you can deconstruct the current power systems, you open up new opportunities for power, and then you can take it for yourself.
Yes, that's how I also I forget, Sam, you said something seemed more like late stage capitalism, and like I hear that and I'm like, yeah, Marxism. I mean, late stage capitalism is is an idea that I associate with Marxists. It's so like I forget, I wrote it down. I can't remember exactly where you said it.
It was Baudrillard with the simulacra.
Yes.
And the hyperreal.
So does that not tie him to Marxism somehow?
Oh, for sure, they were reacting to Marxism, and the postmodernists found some sympathies with certain Marxists, and some postmodernists could have themselves been Marxists. They just couldn't have consistently, at least, thought that like Marxism is an objective truth. They might have just like recognized for themselves that for their own political sympathies, given the social construction of their identity, Marxism makes sense. But that they can understand also why people with different narratives might choose another meta-narrative for themselves.
I find that, like, I feel like if this is the way I look at it, and I understand you've made it painfully clear, and I'm sorry that I keep reiterating it, but I don't see how you can, to me, one leads to the other in a way that's obvious, and the people doing it must have known. Now, maybe that's wrong, maybe I'm mind reading, but if your attitude is to critique the power structures because they're more dangerous, so the more powerful you are, the more dangerous you are, and we know that capitalism is the most powerful on the planet, then how is this not at least somehow tied to a sort of Marxist revolution while evading the label and the history of Marxism? It seems like
there's the claim that there's like an ethical imperative to deconstruct, I think, is dubious. There's no ethical imperative. So you can criticize capitalism all you want while still thinking that capitalism is the best economic system we've developed.
I don't believe that people do things without an ethical imperative. So when people are not sure what to do and they find, I think that when people find something that's working for them, I don't see it. I mean, they don't have to know that it's.
You think when I go to the coffee shop because I want to get some coffee that it's done out of an ethical imperative?
Why did you choose that coffee shop?
Because I like it.
Why do you like it?
Tastes good.
Why does it matter if it tastes good?
I like stuff that tastes good.
I mean, I could go down to the beauty argument.
This isn't ethical. Like, it's, it might be aesthetic. It could be.
But aesthetic, to me, beauty is ethical. I mean.
Okay, then this is going to go nowhere fast.
Well, there are obviously imperatives that don't derive from ethics, right? Like, I need to drink water. That's not ethical.
True. True.
Yeah, anything that's a subconscious drive or like a physiological need isn't going to be a consciously ethical choice.
Yeah, but if you're actively choosing to say, I believe these people in that the best way to go about this is to criticize what I see as the most powerful, what I see as the most dangerous. I mean, I don't know how you do that without
But you're reading into it the idea that the best way to go about this is, they might not think that this is the best way to go about this. They might not make any claims about the best way to do anything. They could just say, look, this is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in power. I want to know how power works. So I'm going to come up with this theory. Or I want to know the history of sexuality, right? Oh, why do we like institutionalize gay people? Okay, like let's trace the history of sexuality, and like where did the concept like gay people come from? Did it always exist, or did we sometimes not categorize people based on their sexuality? Like, you don't need to think that anything is the best way of doing anything to do any of this genealogy, archaeology business that Foucault is interested in. It seems to me that Foucault was just like an intellectual. He wanted to know how this stuff works, and so he came up with a theory about how it works.
Well, so if they're right, and all of your ideas about what's right and wrong aren't really your decision, that they're sort of, I mean, they're inherited by your culture, basically. They're social constructs, I guess, right?
Right, like that's like the idea of how like you get these things in the first place. But Foucault himself was specific towards the end of his career that he was and it seemed to me always present. It seemed to be sort of implicit in what he was doing with like his historical genealogies, that like there is an other that is possible that you can make for yourself.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean it would still be socially constructed, because the ways that you get these ideas for what the future should look like is still, everything is still like a social process that leads up to it.
Okay,
but it's sort of like the Nietzschean, like going beyond, although it's not. It just doesn't claim to be universal. It's very consciously individual.
I'm following, but I guess I'm gonna try to. I think that individualism can be a universal claim. Like the idea.
It can be. Yeah, it can be.
But so let's say we'll simplify this situation and say that we live in a tribe. It's never been influenced by outside tribes. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that. And in our tribe, it is correct to cut off your left pinky toe. It's like the right thing to do, right? When you turn 18, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the postmodernists would say, it's you as an individual should think about that, because especially because there's a structure here that's being followed unquestioningly, right?
They might say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not trying to make assumptions. I'm trying to put out an idea, and you bang me into fitting properly.
If I could real quick, Jimmy, wouldn't it be the case that they would say that because it is an attempt to hold power over the individual?
That's kind of where I was going. I think that would that be accurate, Sam?
Well, that would assume that just because there is power, something is therefore worse or more worth questioning. Now, I would be skeptical about the first claim, but they might say that like the more power there is, the more reasons we have to question it. That would make sense.
Yes. Okay. So let's say in this same tribe, so that I as a person, I do this. No one told me to. I just decide this doesn't feel right to me, and I discover postmodern critique on my own, and I say I'm not cutting off my toe anymore. I'm not cutting it off. And it's a good thing, right? And it works out well for everybody, because I don't know, the people who, whatever. Let's just say it works, right? It's a good thing. People stop cutting off their toes. There's less of a problem of people whose toes are bigger and get cut off or seen as better or something. I don't know. Let's say it works, and then I start writing down. Being critical of the power structure is, I mean, how do you say that without saying it's a good thing? Like, just how do you say that without saying you should, or like, how is this? Not
Shouldn't you be critical of the power structure?
Let's just say they describe the positives of that's what it is. They describe the positives of being critical of the power structure, right? And they can point to the toe problem and that being going away. Now, let's say suddenly we find people being critical of all sorts of things because that has worked. It's shown to be working, but the cohesive, like the glue that keeps the society together is also falling apart. So let's say they stop.
But you're taking a win in one aspect and you're declaring that it's a win in all aspects, right? Because you're saying, since I questioned it once and it worked out well, now everything that's come from that same source of authority is no longer valid. And that's where you get in trouble.
Yes, but I also think that's sort of what's happening.
Oh, exactly.
So that might be what's happening right now, but it in no way follows from postmodernism's basic.
I'm not making an intent argument. I'm actually making a postmodern argument that intent is not all that important here. But
so I'm not talking about intent. I'm just saying that, like, you saying that it's good to question power structures,
I mean,
doesn't mean it's good to come to a certain conclusion about power structures.
No, I'm not trying to. I'm trying to. Okay, let's say the same situation, right? That happens, and then the people start like being critical of all the rules, and things start to really fall apart, right? And then they fucking murder me because they realize when we started questioning things, everything fell apart, and now they cut off 3 toes just to be fucking sure of it. I mean, I'm being extreme, but it's sort of how I see this playing out, and I can't really understand how it can play out any other way, because you don't need to say should for people to interpret it that way, because when people see such and such thing is okay, use diets. Fads, right? Like a fad diet comes out. You don't even have to say you should. You just have to show your results on Instagram, and like people do shit. You become the exact thing. This is my meta argument. You become the exact power structure that is worthy of being criticized. And I don't see how it doesn't just spiral downward until it's just viciously stopped, and the reaction to it, I'm worried, is worse. I don't want to like be in a culture that reacts by saying, you know what, enough is enough, and we become like hyper conservative. But I'm actually genuinely concerned about that.
Yeah, but
Chippy, you had something to say?
Yeah, so that sounds to me like the common issue with the way deconstruction is perceived to be supposed to be applied in postmodernism. And Sam, you're welcome to correct me if I'm misunderstanding it, but from what I understood, deconstructionism was how it was supposed to be applied was not so much in questioning anything and everything as in like a consistent state of skepticism, but in like being capable of perceiving multiple viewpoints on certain topics so that you can come to a better conclusion as to the correct direction to take. So in your analogy, it wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, I'm questioning authority. It would be, oh, you know, why are we cutting off our toes? Is this beneficial to anybody? Or, you know.
Right. That's sort of how I mean questioning. Like when I think of questioning, it's not like a negative thing. It's just sort of trying to ask why something is a certain way and then come up with potential answers, and then once we figure out what we think like the best answer is, then we can ask another question like, should it be this way? And then there are a number of possible answers to that, and we should try to decide what the best answers to that are.
It's not supposed to be applied as hyper skepticism, and this was one of my criticisms of the book. Was his section on deconstruction was just, I felt was misrepresentative of what deconstruction is supposed to, how it's supposed to be applied.
Yeah, I felt like anybody who has any sort of religious belief who reads this book is going to have trouble with it, because
for sure,
it's you can't, if you follow his way of looking at it. I mean, so far, I haven't read the book, and this was my concern with the book from the get-go, is that it's going to be such an extreme response to postmodernism in too far an objective way that it's going to be, I'm worried, to be ineffective, or worse, effective in a polarizing way. And that, I don't know, that concerns me a little bit.
Let's talk about the neoliberal world order, if you would. Like, so we invaded Iraq, right? It didn't work out. They've been in the civil war for 20 years. Et cetera, et cetera. So I think everyone agrees that it was a bad idea, and we should, and they fucked up there. So I think so Foucault's clearly right. We should question, the neoliberal world order and what they do. But I think that there's an argument: is there room within the current system for them to make it better? All right, now we see that, maybe we should have just invaded these countries, and they'll be in long civil wars, and we can't just install a democracy, and it's not that easy, and we can adjust within our current framework. Or is our framework just rotten to the core, and it's unable to make such an adjustment, and we're just fucked?
I mean, I think this goes to what Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, in a model I like, which is basically that you have a system of order that we've built over time, and you can't really just destroy it and replace it. You just have to expect that the upcoming generations add new revisions to the system of order.
Yeah, reform, not revolution. I'm pretty sympathetic to that.
Yeah, which is important, just because if we take it back to the deconstruction, if we take it back to what you were talking about with challenging authority, Jimmy, the challenge is, can you question authority in a way that allows you to productively help the masses to benefit society as a whole? This is the hero's journey, or do you selfishly question for the sake of pulling the power from the top and placing it in your hands so that you can build your new thing by destroying the old thing?
Yeah, and I don't see why the postmodern approach would necessarily lead to the latter. I definitely think that there are some scholars working today influenced by certain postmodern thinkers who do lead towards the latter. Like Robin DiAngelo clearly is a nut. And it, like, when we get to chapter 8, we'll see that I think that basically the only person that they come up with a very reasonable critique of is Robin DiAngelo. But for reform to even be possible, you need to question authority. So just having the lens be question authority, I don't see the problem in that.
Someone said something in the chat on YouTube that they said intellectual dark web, that's a postmodern way of thinking, and I think that's a good representation of what postmodernism was meant to do.
Yeah,
not necessarily that.
That's actually one of my biggest criticisms of Jordan Peterson, because he's actually referenced William James.
He's a huge postmodernist.
I'm sorry I keep bringing
up. That's what I thought when I first started looking into Jordan Peterson. I'm like, he talks kind of like someone who's and I'm talking like postmodern in the sense of like, a lot of major scholarly or intellectual thinking, post 1960, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has a lot of that going on in the way he is, but he's not like this weird like distilled postmodernism that's become this like leviathan, right?
I think that he is a pragmatist, and pragmatism is part of the postmodern movement as far as most people define it. So
yeah.
The issue I think he has is, as a pragmatist, and I struggle with this too, is he sees things as what they do, and he sees postmodernism as doing this crazy stuff. So to him, that is postmodernism. It's distinct, and I can't accept that label.
That's because he read Stephen Hicks's book explaining postmodernism, which is just a crock of shit.
Well, I mean, I feel similarly too, because like, I'm just going to say it because I find it useful in navigating these sort of waters down what I see to be a middle path. But William James's definition of truth is a thing that you believe in that is useful. So he can say, there was a time.
It's crazy.
What?
It's just a crazy way to think about truth.
I don't agree. I mean, it's you have to believe in it, right? Because if you don't believe in it, it can't be true.
What? Like, oh my God, this would lead to like everyone. You can't criticize any of the people in the book because their scholarship is useful to them. Got them tenure.
No, it has to be ultimately useful. So like, an example would be the world is flat. If you went back in time and said to the people that the world was round, it would not be true, because it would be useless to you to say it. It would be useless. It's a useless thing to say. And it becomes.
I think this is just like, you can have this concept of truth, but then we're gonna just talk past one another forever, because hardly anybody means that today when they talk about truth in our culture.
I think they do in their actions. When he sees it as, like I said, it's like an adjective. It's not a. I mean, everybody sees truth as an adjective, don't they?
Right. Truth is a noun. True is an adjective.
No, truth is also an adjective.
Both of them are adjectives.
Yes.
You can think about it that way. As long as it's useful to you, it's true. I mean, it's truth.
Are you still talking about
pragmatism? You guys, I gotta get out of here, man. It's been a long.
It's been a long. Yeah. So do I. It's been good. Yeah, we'll chat a little bit tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks for being patient, Sam, with the questions. I know it might feel like people are sort of like on a different side, but I feel like you gave a good explanation for your thoughts.
I'm gonna put this out there. I feel like the conversation became a lot more useful at the end.
Yeah, towards the end when we started talking about like, what do my critiques mean, like, for the purposes of the book? Should this chapter even be in the book?
Yes.
What is the book?
And if Eric is going to participate again, he's going to have to acquiesce to this sort of conversation, I think. That's my opinion. Like, I appreciate his opinion, but it's just too much.
The rest of the book will be the criticisms will inherently be more pertinent, because this is the only chapter of the book that you can really say, well, why the fuck is this in here, right? Like, why like, this doesn't even mean anything to their ultimate goal.
That's
whereas
why
the rest of it is like, this is what the book is supposed to be all about.
That's what I felt the whole time reading it. I was just like, ugh, why did we get into this? This is, I mean, I agree with a lot of his conclusions in the way that I look at it, but it's a slippery thing, and it's not doing anything to further their argument. I don't think. I really think it's added there for people. Somebody read this book. The publisher read the book and was like, you immediately start talking about things that nobody knows what they are or where they came from. You have to have a chapter in there about what this is.
I think they really wanted like to talk about them because they want to give the genealogy, and they think that they understand these thinkers enough to explain them in a chapter. And they know that they're, you know, most of their readers aren't going to go read Foucault or Lyotard or any of these thinkers to check that they got the exegesis right. So
well, that's kind of the point, right? Is that people wouldn't do that. Because if they did do that, there'd be no reason.
Huh?
If they did do that, there'd be no point to the chapter, right? Because like the whole point to the chapter is like postmodernism for dummies.
Like, yeah, we read
like,
them.
Yeah, exactly.
We read them, so you don't have to. But
yeah,
the problem with that is it doesn't seem all very convincing to someone who.
I think I'll go back to my point. The chapter is pretty short. Like, they're covering a lot of ground. The chapter is pretty short.
Well, it's like if they just failed to cover things, that would make sense, right? But if you think they got things wrong, it's like of the few things they wrote, they chose some wrong things to write. So like,
I don't know. Yeah, I think it's unclear if they got things wrong.
Oh yeah, for sure. I just mean like if it would be. I think that's a stronger argument if you're just like they left out some important stuff. You could say, well, yeah, but they're trying to cover like hundreds of pages of material in 20 pages or 15 pages.
Right. Yeah. I think a good critique that Sam has is they could have used some real like better money quotes in here. Like Sam was questioning us about, you know, does Foucault really not believe in science? You know, does Foucault really question science strong way? And I think he does, but they don't have like a money, you know, Foucault, you know, saying how science is bad and stuff in here.
Right, and you can point to quotes of Foucault's where he makes it explicit that he's not saying those things.
Right, and whoa, this is what we disagree with. I think Foucault actually has like some money quotes where he's like, you know, science is, you know. All
right, well let's write them down and let's trade in the chat tomorrow.
And the other people like Derrida and so they could have really like they have like a Derrida cultural relativism, but they could have like really, you know, cherry picked some like really good quotes from them, and they don't really do it that much.
They could have cherry picked.
They could have cherry picked, and they did not. That's wow! What a review. 4 stars on Amazon.
Oh, but they
they could have cherry picked, and they did.
They could have cherry picked a little better. They didn't convince me.
No,
I wasn't dogmatically sure.
I was reading this, and I was just like, with the people like Sam. I'm not talking about you. But the people who are extremely defensive of postmodernism, when you talk about the ills of it, which there are, this chapter is just like, it's like gasoline for them on the fire. Like it's like when it's like when you see the like CNN do something about Trump, and it's just like you just gave the guy so much ammo. That's what I felt like reading this chapter. You've let them you've sort of let them you've gone into the snare of trying to define postmodernism, and it's a pointless thing to get into. And
maybe that's what they wanted to do. Maybe they wanted to get people's hackles up, and so that people would talk about it, and that they would be on Twitter, and you know,
true.
Maybe that's part of why they wrote the chapter.
That's true. Yeah. I don't know.
Jimmy, are you going to keep your schedule on like Fridays?
Yeah, I think that's the plan.
And like, what is it, like a chapter?
It's pinned in the books channel. It's basically 2 chapters every week.
2 chapters,
except for chapter 8 is alone.
Yeah, so 2 and 3.
2 and 3 for next Friday. How many pages we got?
Probably 30.
That's not much.
40
pages.
Maybe.
Yeah, y'all have a good
All
night.
right,
I'm gonna head out and go
Yeah.
watch some brainless TV.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah.
I'm watching Big Brain TV.
Good night.
So.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for being patient.
Hey,
nice
thanks
talking to everybody.
Thanks everyone. I appreciate the discussion for real.
Yeah. Have a good one, guys.
I'm